Who let that girl get this hungry? Edward Whitmore asked softly, his eyebrows tightening as he looked through the windshield. Malcolm, his driver, followed his gaze. Across the street, beneath the yellow light spilling from an upscale restaurant in Midtown Atlanta, a young black woman stood beside a large dumpster in the alley. Malcolm was silent for a few seconds. Then he leaned slightly toward the steering wheel and sighed. She must be starving, Mr. Whitmore. Look at her hands. She's going through every little thing in that trash like she's afraid someone might take even that away from her. Edward did not answer right away. The black car was parked close to the curb, its engine almost silent. A gentle stream of warm air came from the heater vents, a sharp contrast to the cold evening outside. Edward had come here to meet Nathan Cole, a business partner who was already late. In his mind, he had prepared several complaints about wasted time. But then he saw the girl. She stood beside the dumpster near the restaurant's back door. Every few seconds, she lifted her head and looked around, her eyes moving from the sidewalk to the restaurant door, then back to the street. After that, she lowered her head again and continued searching. Her hands moved quickly through the trash, but not carelessly. She lifted dirty napkins aside, pushed away empty paper cups, opened takeout containers one by one, checked inside them, then wiped the lids gently with the sleeve of her old coat. Whenever she found a few pieces of food that still looked edible, she placed them into a thin plastic bag tied around her wrist. After a while, she pulled out a torn piece of wrapping paper. Inside were a few dry pieces of bread. Edward watched as she used 2 fingers to brush the dust from the bread. She flattened the wrapper, blew softly over the crust, then carefully placed it into the bag. Something cold and hard as stone seemed to move quietly inside Edward's chest. "What kind of time are we living in?" he said under his breath, almost to himself. How can a person be so hungry that she has to do that in the middle of this city? Malcolm's face tightened. He had worked for Edward for 11 years. He knew when to speak and when to stay silent. But this time, he chose to speak, though carefully. "Some people hide their hunger for a long time, sir, until they no longer have any way to hide it." Edward looked toward the restaurant behind the alley. Warm light poured through the glass windows. Inside, people sat around tables covered with white cloths, raising glasses, laughing, and enjoying expensive meals. And just across the street, that girl bent over a dumpster, searching for dinner. At that moment, the restaurant's side door swung open. 2 men stepped outside. They wore dark coats and carried themselves with easy confidence, laughing as they walked. One of them noticed the girl. He slowed down for half a step. His expression changed for a moment, but a second later, he turned his face away and kept walking. The girl stood completely still until they were gone. Only when she was sure no one was watching did she continue searching. Edward clenched his jaw. "Stay here," he said. Malcolm turned to look at him. "Sir, wait for me in the car. I want to see what's going on. Would you like me to come with you?" Edward shook his head. "No, I don't want to frighten her." Malcolm nodded, though worry remained in his eyes. "Please be careful, sir." Edward opened the car door and stepped out into the cold. He closed the door quietly, then crossed the street toward the corner. At first, the girl did not see him. She was still bent over the dumpster, one hand holding the plastic bag open while the other searched through discarded food containers. Every few seconds, she glanced around, quick and nervous, then kept going. She found another container, opened it, lifted it to smell, and hesitated. In the end, she did not take what was inside. Instead of throwing it back, she carefully set it aside. Edward stopped at the mouth of the alley. "Hey," he called gently. "Hello, miss." She startled. The plastic bag was immediately pressed tight against her chest. She spun around, her eyes wide, her whole body ready to step back or run if she had to. For a moment, neither of them moved. Edward lowered his voice. "Were you going to take that food?" he asked. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She looked at the plastic bag in her hand, then at the dumpster beside her, then down at the sidewalk, as if the ground was easier to face than his eyes. Her fingers tightened around the handle of the bag until the thin plastic turned white. "I wasn't stealing," she said very softly. The words cut into Edward's heart. "I didn't say you were stealing," he replied. She swallowed. It had already been thrown away. "I know. I was just going to—" She stopped. Tears rose before she could stop them. She blinked quickly, trying to force the emotion back down. But the tears still rolled down her face. I was just going to take what was still good. Edward looked at the bag. The corner of a takeout box pressed against the thin plastic. A few pieces of dry bread were wrapped in torn paper. She had cleaned them as if they were something precious. He reached into his coat. You don't need to eat that. She let out a small, trembling breath. It's okay. No, Edward said. It is not okay. He took out his wallet, pulled out several bills, and held them toward her. Take this, he said. Go buy yourself a proper meal. Something hot. Sit down somewhere. Eat like you should. Her eyes stopped on the money. Her hunger showed on her face before she could hide it. Her lips trembled. Her shoulders pulled inward. A tear slid down her cheek, and she turned her face slightly away, as if even that tear embarrassed her. She needed that money. Edward could see it clearly. Her body needed it. Her empty stomach needed it. The cold evening itself seemed to be urging her to take the money, run into some bright place, order a bowl of soup hot enough to burn her tongue, and sit down like a human being for the first time that day. But she did not reach for it. Thank you, sir, she whispered. But I can't take it. Edward frowned. You can. She shook her head. You don't have to pay me back. I know. Then take it. Her voice became even smaller. No, sir. Edward's expression turned uncertain. He was not angry yet. He was simply confused by a kind of refusal he was not used to seeing. What is it? He asked. You don't want my money? She looked up. A flash of hurt crossed her eyes. No, sir. It's not that. Do you know how many people come to me every week asking for help? Edward said, irritation rising before he could hold it back. Do you know how many people would take this money without thinking twice? She nodded once. Tears still clung to the corners of her eyes. That's exactly why I can't take it, she said. Edward fell silent. She wiped her cheek with the back of her hand, leaving a faint streak of dust near her temple. There are people who need it more than I do, she said. Mrs. Clara in my building needs money for medicine. There's a man on the 3rd floor who lost work hours last week. I'm only short because my paycheck was delayed. I'll manage. Edward stared at her as if those words could not possibly have come from someone standing beside a dumpster. You're hungry, he said. Yes, sir. And you still think someone else needs help more than you do? She tightened her grip on the bag. There are people who can't work anymore. I still can. Before Edward could answer, hurried footsteps sounded on the sidewalk. 2 women approached them. Both wore worn-out coats. Both were staring at the money in Edward's hand. One was middle-aged, with a red scarf wrapped around her head. The other was younger, her cheeks hollow, her eyes sharpened by desperation. She doesn't want it? The woman in the red scarf said quickly. Then give it to me. The younger woman stepped closer too. I need it too. Sir, if she's too proud, I'm not. I really need help. Edward turned, surprised by how quickly they had appeared. Ladies, he said, wait a moment. But the woman in the red scarf had already reached for the money. Annie stepped back, startled. No, don't. The younger woman grabbed Edward's wrist from the other side. You were just going to give it away, right? I said wait, Edward snapped, but they did not listen. Hunger and desperation can make people reckless. The woman in the red scarf tugged at the money. The younger woman grabbed the edge of one bill. For a few short seconds, Annie stood frozen beside the dumpster, her face twisted with shame, as if the struggle was somehow her fault. Edward's patience ran out. Enough. His voice was not loud, but it was cold enough to make both women stop immediately. Edward pulled the bills back. He looked from one face to the other. His eyes became stern. Step back. The younger woman let go first. The woman in the red scarf held on for half a second longer, then released the bills and raised both hands. Don't look at me like that, she muttered. You don't know what I need. Edward's voice slowed. You're right. I don't know. And that is exactly the problem. The woman blinked. Edward put the money back into his wallet. Not because he wanted to keep it, but because he suddenly understood that handing out cash in this alley would only turn human suffering into a fight. Annie was still standing there, tears silently running down her cheeks. I'm sorry, she whispered. Edward turned to her. For what? For all of this? No. His voice softened at once. You have nothing to apologize for. The 2 women remained nearby, watching him. Edward reached into his coat again. But this time, he did not take out cash. He took out 3 business cards. On the back of each one, he wrote a few lines in firm handwriting. He handed one card to each woman. "The Whitmore Foundation," he said. "Tomorrow morning. Go there and ask for emergency assistance. Tell them Edward Whitmore referred you. Food, medicine, rent support, whatever the intake team can arrange. You will be treated with respect." The woman in the red scarf slowly took the card. Suspicion and hope struggled across her face. "Are you serious?" "Yes." The younger woman looked down at the card in her hand. "They won't throw us out?" "No," Edward said. "They won't." The two women stepped back. They were still hesitant, but quieter now. Before leaving, the woman in the red scarf looked at Annie one last time. "You should have taken the money," she said, but her voice no longer carried the same sharpness. Annie did not answer. When they walked away, the alley suddenly felt emptier. The rain began to fall again, light and cold. Edward took the last business card from his pocket. This one was different. Thick white paper, printed with his name, office address, and private number. He turned it over, wrote a few more lines on the back, then held it out to her. Annie looked at the card with wet eyes, but she still did not dare take it. "This is not cash," Edward said. "This is a door." "A door?" Her voice almost disappeared into the rain. "A job interview. A real interview. A chance to work somewhere that pays on time." She looked down at the bag of food in her hand. "You don't even know who I am. I know you are hungry, but you still refused money because you believed someone else might need it more," Edward said. "I know you are working. I know someone delayed your paycheck, and somehow you are the one standing here ashamed. For me, that is enough to begin with." Annie's lower lip trembled. She tried to say something, but no words came out. At last, she pressed her mouth shut, as if afraid that if she opened it, the last of her strength would break apart. Edward waited. After a long moment, she reached out with both hands and took the business card. She held it carefully, as if afraid to bend the only chance that had fallen into her life. "Tomorrow morning," Edward said. "Whitmore Global Holdings. Give that card to the receptionist. Tell them you need to see me. What if they don't believe me? They will. What if this is a mistake?" Edward's face softened. "Then let it be my mistake," he said. "Not yours." Annie slipped the card inside her coat to protect it from the rain. In her other hand, she still held the plastic bag. The rescued scraps of food swung between her hands, like proof of how far this evening had pushed her, and how hard she had fought to remain standing. Edward stepped back. "I won't keep you any longer," he said. She lifted her eyes to him. "If you work for me," Edward continued, "no one will ever be allowed to delay your paycheck until you have to come back here looking for dinner in a dumpster. Not once." For the first time, Annie's expression changed. It was not exactly a smile, but it looked like someone who had spent too long in the dark suddenly seeing a thin line of light beneath a door. Across the street, Malcolm sat behind the wheel, quietly watching everything. Edward's phone was still vibrating on the back seat. It was probably Nathan Cole, asking where he was. But Edward did not look toward the car. Edward walked back toward the car more slowly than he had crossed the street earlier. Malcolm had already opened the rear door for him, but Edward lingered on the sidewalk for a few more seconds. He looked back across the street toward the alley. Annie was still there. She had not left right away. She stood beneath the weak yellow glow of the streetlight, one hand tucked inside her coat where she had placed the business card. Her other hand still held the thin plastic bag filled with the scraps of food she had rescued. "Mr. Whitmore?" Malcolm called softly. Edward got into the car without answering. The door closed. The city outside immediately became quieter, but not quiet enough to stop him from seeing her through the side window. Malcolm glanced into the rearview mirror. "Shall we go, sir?" "Not yet." The phone on the seat vibrated again. Nathan Cole's name appeared on the screen. Edward picked it up, declined the call, and placed the phone face down on the seat. Malcolm remained silent for a few seconds. Then, in the careful voice of a man who had lived long enough to know when a question truly mattered, he asked, "What did she say to you?" Edward kept his eyes on the alley. "She said her paycheck was delayed." Malcolm let out a slow breath. "That can break a person faster than most people think." Edward turned his head slightly. "You sound like you know that well." "I do." Malcolm tightened his hands lightly on the steering wheel, even though the car was still parked. "My father worked 34 years in a furniture factory outside Macon. One summer, his paycheck was delayed 3 Fridays in a row. The company said it was a bank issue. The bank said it was paperwork. And we ate beans until my mother couldn't look at a pot without crying." Edward looked down at his hands. Malcolm continued, When rich people say something is late, they usually mean it is inconvenient. But when poor people say something is late, sometimes it means the lights get shut off, medicine gets skipped, or there is no dinner. Edward's jaw tightened. She wouldn't take the money. I saw that. She said someone else needed it more. Malcolm nodded sadly. Sometimes the people with the least are the ones who think about others the most. Across the street, Annie finally moved. She stepped away from the dumpster and walked along the sidewalk, her shoulders drawn in against the cold rain. One hand remained tucked inside her coat, protecting the business card the same way she had protected those pieces of bread. "Follow her," Edward said. Malcolm looked at him through the rearview mirror. "From a distance," Edward added. "Don't make her feel like she's being followed. I just want to make sure she gets where she needs to go." Malcolm shifted the car into gear. "Yes, sir." They did not follow too closely. The car stayed half a block behind as Annie walked beneath awnings, past dimly lit storefronts, avoiding the crowds gathered outside bars and restaurants. She kept her head down and walked steadily through the rain, like someone who had learned to move through the city without expecting anyone to notice her. A little while later, Annie turned onto a quieter street and stopped near a bus shelter. The plastic cover was scratched. One end of the bench underneath was wet. Annie did not sit. She stood there, her back slightly bent from the cold. From inside the car, Edward saw her take the food container from the bag and open the lid. "She's eating," Malcolm said quietly. Edward did not answer. Annie ate with her hands, very slowly, very carefully. She took one small bite, then another. After that, she stopped, closed the container, and put it back into the bag. She did not finish it. "Saving it for someone else," Malcolm said. Edward closed his eyes for a moment. A bus pulled up with a wet hiss of brakes against the road. Annie climbed aboard. Malcolm eased the car to the curb, and Edward sat still, watching through the windshield as the bus carried her south. Its two red lights faded slowly into the rain. "Should we keep following, sir?" Malcolm asked. Edward shook his head. "No, she kept the business card. Do you think she'll come?" Edward looked at the empty bus stop. "I don't know." Malcolm gently guided the car back into traffic. "Pride can keep a person warm for a little while," he said, "but it can't keep them warm all night." Edward did not answer, because he knew Malcolm was right. 20 minutes later, on the other side of the city, Annie stepped off the bus and walked 3 more blocks to an old apartment building. The brick walls had darkened with age. Some of the windows were covered with Annie climbed to the second floor and stopped in front of apartment 2C. She knocked very softly. "Mrs. Bennett?" she called. "It's me." The lock turned slowly. Clara Bennett opened the door with one hand, the other resting on her cane. She wore a faded pale blue robe and house slippers flattened by years of use. Her face was lined with wrinkles, and her eyes looked tired, but when she saw Annie standing there, soaked and trembling, her voice immediately filled with concern. "Lord have mercy, child. Get in here before you catch your death of cold." Annie stepped inside. Clara's apartment was small but tidy. A lamp with a slightly crooked shade stood beside an old armchair. Prescription bottles were lined up on the kitchen counter beside a stack of mail, held down by a chipped mug. On the table sat half a sleeve of saltine crackers and a cup of tea that had gone cold. Annie held out the plastic bag. "I brought you some food." Clara looked into the bag, then looked back at Annie's face. "Have you eaten?" "I had a little." "How much is a little?" Annie tried to smile. "Enough." Clara did not believe that answer. She took the bag, opened it, and saw the food container and the pieces of bread wrapped so carefully. Then she closed her eyes. "Annie, it's still good," Annie said quickly. "I checked it. I didn't bring you anything spoiled. That is not what breaks my heart." Annie turned her face away. Clara set the bag on the table, then gently touched Annie's sleeve. "You're shaking. It's just the rain." "It is not just the rain." For a few seconds, Annie tried to hold herself still, but Edward's voice echoed in her mind. The business card was inside her coat. The way he had said no one would ever be allowed to delay her paycheck until she had to return to a dumpster to find dinner. Annie's eyes stung again. Clara's voice softened at once. "Come here, baby." Annie did not step forward right away, but Clara remained there, waiting patiently. Finally, Annie crossed the small room and let the older woman wrap one arm around her while the cane leaned against the table. "I met a man tonight," Annie whispered against Clara's shoulder. "What kind of man?" "A very rich one." Clara gave a quiet groan. "In Atlanta, That does not narrow the list very much. Despite herself, Annie let out a weak laugh. Then she stepped back and took the business card from inside her coat. Its edges were still dry. She placed it on the table beside the cold tea. He gave me this. Told me to come see him tomorrow. Clara adjusted her glasses and read the name on the card. Edward Whitmore. Her expression changed. This is not an ordinary rich man. I know. What did you tell him? Annie wiped her face. I told him I had a job. I told him my paycheck was late. And? He tried to give me money. Clara looked up. Did you take it? Annie shook her head. Clara's eyebrows drew together, but she did not scold her immediately. Why not? Because you need medicine, and Mr. Darrell just had his hours cut again. I couldn't stand there and take all that cash like I was the only hungry person in this building. If this moment touched your heart, please give this video a like. And in the comments, tell us where you are watching from today. Stories like Annie's remind us that kindness can survive even in the hardest places. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories about hope, justice, and the power of compassion. Clara slowly sat down. Annie Brooks, your heart is bigger than your body. That is both a blessing and a danger. I wasn't trying to do something foolish. I know. That is what makes it hurt even more. Annie touched the business card lightly with the tip of her finger. He said it wasn't money. He said it was a door. Clara was silent for a long time. Outside the window, rain tapped against the fire escape. Down the hallway, footsteps echoed, then faded away. Finally, Clara said, then tomorrow you put on the cleanest clothes you have, hold your head high, and walk through that door. What if they laugh at me? They might. What if they don't let me upstairs? Then you show them that card. What if he forgets me? Clara looked at her, her gaze steady. Then you come back here, and we will still know you were brave enough to go. Annie sat across from Clara at the small table. The food between them had come from a dumpster, but Clara still divided it onto 2 plates as if it were Sunday dinner. She gave the larger portion to Annie. Annie started to protest, but Clara raised one thin finger and pointed it straight at her. Do not argue with a retired teacher in her own kitchen. Annie lowered her head and quietly accepted the plate. For the first time that night, she ate without standing, without hiding, without looking over her shoulder. The food had gone cold. The edges of the bread were hard, but Clara warmed everything in a pan with a small piece of butter still wrapped in foil. Somehow, that made the meal feel less like survival and more like a real dinner. The business card remained on the table beside them. Annie kept looking at it between bites. By dawn, the rain had stopped, but the city still carried the damp smell of the night before. Annie woke before her alarm, lying still on the narrow mattress in her small room, listening to the pipes knock inside the wall and the low traffic beginning outside. For a few seconds, she did not remember the card. Then her hand moved under the folded sweater beside her pillow, and her fingers touched the thick white paper. Edward Whitmore. She read the name again, though she had read it 10 times before sleeping. The letters looked too clean for her room, too certain for the life around them. Beneath his printed name was the line he had written on the back. Let Annie Brooks in. She has an appointment with me. An appointment. The word almost made her laugh. People like her did not have appointments with men whose names were on buildings. They waited in lines. They filled out forms. They were told to come back Monday. They were told payroll had a delay. They were told patience was a virtue by people who had never had to be patient with an empty refrigerator. She sat up and pressed the card against her knee. You're going, she whispered, because saying it out loud made it harder to run from. Her cleanest blouse was pale yellow, though the collar had faded from too many washes. She ironed it by laying it under a towel and pressing it with a hot pan because the iron in her room had stopped working months ago. Her jeans were dark enough to pass if no one looked too closely. The sneakers were a problem. She wiped them with a wet cloth until the cracked rubber looked less tired, then tied the laces twice. In the cracked mirror over the sink, she pulled her hair back and smoothed the loose strands with water. Her face looked thinner than she wanted it to. She pinched her cheeks once, then felt foolish and stopped. When she opened her door, Clara was already in the hallway, leaning on her cane, wearing her blue robe under a winter coat. You weren't about to sneak past me, were you? Clara asked. Annie's mouth softened. I didn't want to wake you. At my age, sleep comes and goes like a bus with no schedule. Clara looked her over, not with pity, but with care. You look just fine. I look like I tried. That is better than most people look by noon. Annie gave a small laugh. Then her nerves returned. What if I get there and he isn't serious? Clara reached into her coat pocket and handed Annie a folded paper napkin with 2 pieces of toast inside. Then you eat this on the bus home and tell me everything. But you go first. I don't know how to talk in places like that. You talk like yourself. Don't make yourself smaller to fit inside anybody's office. Annie nodded, but her throat tightened. Clara touched her shoulder. And when they ask your name, you give it clean. First and last. You are not some lost girl off the street. You are Annie Brooks. Annie held the card in her palm all the way to the bus stop. She did not put it in her pocket until the bus came, afraid somehow it might disappear. On the ride north, Atlanta changed outside the window. Low brick buildings gave way to coffee shops, hotels, glass towers, and streets washed bright by morning. Men and women in pressed clothes stepped out of ride shares and crossed sidewalks with purpose. Annie watched them and wondered what it felt like to move through the morning without counting coins. Whitmore Global Holdings rose above Peachtree Street in a tower of steel and glass. The name near the entrance was cut into dark stone. Annie stood across the street for almost a full minute, the card hidden in her hand, her pulse beating so hard she could feel it in her wrist. A man in a navy suit brushed past her and said, "Excuse me," without slowing. That was enough to move her feet. Inside, the lobby was wide and quiet, with polished floors, tall plants, and a security desk where 2 guards stood beside a visitor check-in screen. The air smelled faintly of coffee and lemon cleaner. Annie suddenly became aware of every worn place on her clothes. She felt the split in one sneaker as if it had grown louder. One guard looked up. "Can I help you?" Annie stepped closer and forced her voice to work. "Good morning. My name is Annie Brooks. I'm here to see Mr. Edward Whitmore." The guard paused. The receptionist beside him, a woman with silver glasses and a neat bun, lifted her eyes from the screen. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked. Annie held out the card. "He gave me this." The receptionist took it, turned it over, and read the handwriting. Her face changed just enough for Annie to notice. She picked up the phone and pressed a button. "This is Denise at the front desk," she said. "I have an Annie Brooks here for Mr. Whitmore." She listened, then glanced at Annie again, this time with more care. "Yes, ma'am. I'll send her up." She returned the card. "Mr. Whitmore's assistant is expecting you. Take elevator 4 to the 36th floor." Annie held the card close. "Thank you." The elevator ride felt longer than it was. She stood alone, watching the numbers climb. 22, 23, 24. Her stomach tightened. She had eaten the toast on the bus because Clara would ask, but hunger had already begun to return, dull and familiar. When the doors opened, a woman in her 40s waited near a reception area with framed photographs of warehouses, trucks, and community events on the walls. She wore a gray suit and carried a tablet. "Miss Brooks?" the woman asked. Annie nearly missed the title. "Yes, ma'am. I'm Rachel Mendez, Mr. Whitmore's executive assistant. He asked that you be brought in as soon as you arrived." He remembered. Rachel's expression softened. "He cleared his first hour for you." Annie looked down quickly because the relief almost embarrassed her. Rachel led her down a hall where people spoke in low voices behind office doors. At the end was a conference room, not Edward's private office. There were no large desks between them, no crowd of people waiting to judge her. Just a long table, 2 chairs, a pitcher of water, a pot of coffee, and a tray with scrambled eggs, toast, fruit, and oatmeal. Edward stood when she entered. "Good morning," he said. "I'm glad you came." Annie held the card in both hands. "Good morning, sir. Please have a seat." She sat carefully near the end of the table. Edward did not sit too close. Rachel quietly left and closed the door. For a moment, Annie's eyes went to the food, then away. Edward noticed but did not make a show of it. "Have you had breakfast?" "A little. That usually means not enough." She looked at him, unsure whether to be offended. His voice held no judgment, only concern. "This is not charity," he said. "It's breakfast during an interview. I eat during meetings all the time, and no one calls it charity when I do it." That surprised a small breath of laughter from her. He pushed a plate toward her, then took coffee for himself so she would not feel watched. Annie served herself a little oatmeal, then a piece of toast, then stopped. Edward said nothing. After a minute, She added eggs. "Before we talk about work," he said, "I want to make sure I have your name right." She straightened, remembering Clara's words. "My name is Annie Brooks." "Thank you, Miss Brooks." The title reached her again, steady and respectful. She pressed her hands together in her lap so they would stop trembling. Edward opened a folder but did not read from it. "Tell me about the job you have now." Annie took a sip of water. "It's an industrial laundry service. We handle hotel sheets, towels, robes, uniforms, restaurant linens sometimes. I sort, fold, load carts, help with machines when they need me. Mostly standing. It gets hot." "How long have you worked there?" 6 months. "And your pay has been late before?" She hesitated. "Yes, sir." "How many times?" 3 that I remember, maybe 4. It's usually a few days. This time it's almost 2 weeks. Edward's face did not change much, but his pen stopped moving. "Who told you it was delayed?" "My manager, Marcus Reed. He says payroll has issues, says we should be patient." "Are other people waiting too?" Annie looked down at her plate. "I think so." "Miss Brooks." She lifted her eyes. "I'm not asking so I can blame you. I'm asking because if this is happening to more people, it matters." She breathed in slowly. "Yes, others are waiting too." Edward nodded once. "Why not quit?" The answer came before she could dress it up. "Because poor people don't quit before they have another job, sir. They just keep going." The room became quiet. Edward looked at her for a long second, not with shock this time, but with the weight of someone hearing a truth he should have known already. "That may be the most honest thing anyone has said in this room all year," he said. Annie did not know what to do with that, so she looked at the toast. Edward closed the folder. "I'd like to offer you a trial position at Whitmore Foundation. Operations support. It is not glamorous work. Food distribution schedules, supply lists, community intake, warehouse coordination. You would report to Helen Parker. The pay is hourly, written, and deposited every Friday." "Every Friday?" Annie asked before she could stop herself. "Every Friday. And if payroll has issues, then payroll answers to me." She looked at him, searching for the joke, the trick, the condition hidden beneath kindness. "Why?" Edward did not answer quickly. "Because last night I saw someone working hard to survive on what other people had thrown away. Then I learned she had earned money that had not been paid to her. That is not misfortune. That is failure, and I do not want my company, my foundation, or my conscience standing anywhere near that kind of failure." Annie's eyes burned, but she held the tears back this time. "I don't want to be hired because you feel sorry for me." "Good," Edward said. "I don't want to hire you because I feel sorry for you." "Then why?" "Because you refused money when you needed it. Because you thought of others while hungry. Because you showed up this morning even though every part of this building probably told you to turn around. I can train someone to use a scheduling system. I cannot train character into a person who does not have it." Annie looked at the plate, then at the folder, then at the city beyond the windows. For the first time since she entered, she allowed herself to believe the morning might not end in humiliation. "When would I start?" she asked. Edward's answer was simple. "Today, if you're ready." "Today?" Annie repeated. Edward nodded. "Only if you want to. You can take the day to think." Annie looked at the breakfast tray, the folder, the water glass with a thin line of condensation running down its side. Part of her wanted to say she needed time, not because she did, but because people with options always seemed to ask for time. She had never had that luxury. Bills did not wait. Hunger did not wait. Late rent did not wait. Clara's medicine did not wait. "I can start today," she said. Edward did not smile too broadly, and she was grateful for that. He only nodded once, as if she had made a business decision, and he respected it. "I'll have Rachel take you to Human Resources. You'll fill out paperwork. Then Helen Parker will meet you downstairs at the foundation office." Annie's fingers tightened around the fork. "Mr. Whitmore?" "Yes?" "I don't have my social security card with me. I mean, I have the number memorized, but the card is at home. I didn't know this was real." "That's all right. We'll start what we can today and give you time to bring what's needed. No one here is going to make you feel small over paperwork." She nodded, though the promise sounded almost strange. Edward reached for the phone on the table and called Rachel. "Miss Brooks has accepted a trial position with the foundation. Please walk her through onboarding and let Helen know she'll be down within the hour." When Rachel entered, She carried a folder and a visitor badge printed with Annie's name. Not guest. Not unknown. Annie Brooks. Annie looked at it longer than she meant to. Rachel noticed. Would you like me to clip it on your jacket? I can do it, Annie said quickly, then softened her voice. Thank you. Edward stood. I'll check in later. For now, you'll be in good hands. Annie rose too. Thank you, sir. You earned the chance to be here, he said. Remember that before you thank me too much. Rachel led Annie down the hall. The office had the quiet hum of printers, muted phone calls, shoes moving over carpet. People glanced up as they passed. Some nodded politely. Some looked curious. Annie kept her shoulders steady, but inside, she felt every inch of the distance between her patched jeans and their pressed suits. At Human Resources, a woman named Linda offered her coffee and a seat. She spoke kindly, but not sweetly, which Annie liked. Sweetness could sometimes feel like pity wearing perfume. We'll go step by step, Linda said. Nothing complicated. Forms appeared: address, emergency contact, tax information, direct deposit. Annie wrote carefully, the way Clara had taught her when she was little enough to still believe neat handwriting could protect a person from being misunderstood. When the direct deposit form came up, Annie hesitated. I don't have a bank account, she said. Linda looked up, but her face did not change. That's fine. We work with a local credit union. They can help set up a basic account with no monthly fee. Until then, we can issue a check. A real check? Yes. On Friday? Linda's pen paused. Every Friday. Annie looked down. Sorry, I keep asking. Don't apologize for wanting to be paid for work. The sentence went through Annie quietly. She wondered how many times a person had to be denied something normal before normal began to feel like a favor. When the paperwork was done, Rachel took her down several floors to a part of the building that felt less polished and more used. The Whitmore Foundation offices had open shelves stacked with paper goods, canned food, blankets, hygiene kits, clipboards, maps of delivery zones, and a bulletin board full of handwritten notes. The air smelled like coffee, cardboard, and copy paper. A woman in a dark green sweater was standing over a table covered in supply lists. She had short gray hair, reading glasses hanging from a chain, and the kind of face that suggested she had no patience for laziness but plenty for honest effort. Annie Brooks? She asked. Yes, ma'am. I'm Helen Parker. Around here, ma'am makes me feel older than I already am, so Helen is fine. Annie gave a nervous little nod. Yes, Ma, Helen. Helen's mouth twitched. Close enough. Rachel left them, and Helen handed Annie a clipboard. Mr. Whitmore told me you might be starting today. He did not tell me to go easy on you, which I appreciate. I don't need easy, Annie said, then worried it sounded too sharp. I just mean I can work. I believed you the first time. Helen pointed toward the room beyond them. This is our Community Operations Center. We support food deliveries, emergency supply requests, and referrals for rent, utilities, and medical aid. We are underfunded, overcalled, and allergic to wasted time. Annie looked around at the shelves. Where do you want me? Helen studied her for a second, then handed her a stack of intake sheets. Start with these. We're matching food boxes to households for Friday delivery. The problem is, half the addresses don't line up with the delivery zones. 3 of our volunteers called out, and someone put 2 apartment buildings on the wrong route. Annie took the papers and sat at the end of the table. At first, she simply read names, addresses, phone numbers, notes, elderly, no car, works nights, dialysis Tuesday, phone disconnected, needs porch drop-off, 3rd floor walk-up, leave with neighbor if not home. The notes pulled at her. She knew these lives. Not the exact people, but the shape of them. Helen placed a city map beside her. Use this to sort by route. Annie looked from the map to the list. Do drivers go in this order? Usually. Why? This one doesn't make sense, Annie pointed. You're sending a driver from Edgewood to South Atlanta, then back toward Grant Park, then down again. That's wasting gas and time. Helen leaned over. You know these streets? I take buses through half of them. Annie moved 2 sheets aside. And this woman here, the note says she works nights. If you deliver in the morning, she may not answer. But if she misses the drop, it might get marked no response. Helen's face changed slightly. That happens. It shouldn't. She may be asleep because she just got off work. Helen pulled out a chair and sat beside her. Go on. Annie swallowed, then continued. These two buildings are close, but they're not the same entrance. If the driver leaves boxes at the front office, residents in the back building may not get them. And this man with dialysis, if his treatment is Tuesday, he might be too tired Wednesday. Don't make him come downstairs unless you call first. For several minutes, the only sounds were paper sliding, Annie's pencil moving, and Helen asking short questions. Annie grouped addresses by real travel routes instead of neat lines on a spreadsheet. She marked people who needed calls before delivery, people who could receive for neighbors, people who should not be marked absent after one attempt. Helen finally sat back. Where did you learn this? Annie's pencil stopped. Living it, she said. Helen did not rush to fill the silence. She only nodded. That is a hard school. Yes, but it teaches what our software misses. By mid-afternoon, Annie had reorganized 2 delivery routes and caught 6 duplicate entries. She also found 3 names that had been removed from the delivery list because of missed pickups. This one, she said, tapping a sheet, says, no, show 3 times. But the note says no transportation. Why were they told to pick up downtown? Helen took the paper. Because someone followed the default assignment. Default doesn't feed people. Helen looked at her over the top of her glasses. No, it does not. Near 4 o'clock, Edward came down to the foundation office. He stopped near the doorway, watching without interrupting. Annie was standing now, one hand on the map, explaining a route adjustment to Helen with more confidence than she had walked in with. Helen saw Edward first. You found us a useful one. Annie turned, embarrassed. I'm still learning. Helen snorted. Everyone is still learning. Some people are just less helpful while doing it. Edward walked over. How was the first day? Annie looked at the marked-up papers, the delivery map, the lists that now seemed less like a wall and more like a problem with edges she could touch. It was work, she said. Edward understood the answer better than a simple good. Will you come back tomorrow? Annie nodded. Yes, sir. Helen pointed a pencil at Edward. And payroll? Friday, Edward said. Annie tried not to react, but Edward saw the small release in her shoulders. At the end of the day, Rachel gave Annie a temporary schedule, a bus pass, and instructions for the credit union. Annie accepted the bus pass with hesitation. It's part of the position, Rachel said before Annie could object. Transportation support for hourly staff. Annie closed her fingers around it. Thank you. When she stepped outside, evening had returned to Atlanta. The same city, the same traffic, the same restaurant lights in the distance. But this time, Annie was not walking toward a trash bin. She was walking toward the bus stop with a badge in her pocket, a schedule in her hand, and the first clear promise of a paycheck she had heard in weeks. She did not call it hope yet, but when the bus doors opened, she climbed on, holding her head a little steadier than she had that morning. By the time Annie reached Clara's building, the sky had gone dark enough for kitchen windows to glow along the block. She climbed the stairs with the bus pass tucked inside her pocket and the temporary work schedule folded in her hand. Her feet ached, but it was a different kind of ache from the one she knew. Not the ache of standing in heat while steam soaked through her clothes. Not the ache of counting hours that might never be paid. This ache had a shape to it. A beginning, an end, a reason. Clara opened the door before Annie knocked twice. Well? She asked. Annie tried to answer, but the words crowded her throat. She held up the schedule instead. Clara took it, adjusted her glasses, and read slowly. Whitmore Foundation. Operations Support. Monday through Friday. Her eyes moved down the page. Hourly wage. She stopped there, then looked over the top of the paper. Is this real? Annie nodded. And they're paying you? Friday. This Friday? Yes, ma'am. Clara lowered herself into the chair by the small table as if her knees had decided the news was too much to receive standing up. Sit down before I start praising the Lord loud enough to scare Mrs. Laverne downstairs. Annie sat across from her, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The apartment was quiet except for the refrigerator's weak hum and the faint sound of traffic outside. Clara placed the schedule on the table and smoothed it with both hands the way some people smoothed family photographs. What did they have you doing? She asked. Food delivery lists. Routes. Intake forms. Nothing big. Clara gave her a look. If it feeds somebody, it is not nothing. Annie smiled a little. Helen said something like that. Helen has sense then. She's strict. Good. Soft people don't always know how to help without making a mess. Annie leaned back in the chair. She wanted to tell Clara everything. The breakfast she had been afraid to eat. The way Edward had called her Miss Brooks. The lobby where she had nearly turned around. The paperwork. The credit union. The delivery routes that did not understand bus lines or bad knees or night shifts. But when she opened her mouth, what came out was smaller. I was scared the whole time. Clara's face softened. Of course you were. I kept thinking someone was going to stop me and say there had been a misunderstanding. But they did not. No. Annie looked down at her hands. They gave me a badge. Clara's eyes sharpened. Let me see. Annie pulled the temporary badge from her pocket. The plastic was cheap, the print plain, but her name sat in black letters across the front. Annie Brooks. Whitmore Foundation. Temporary staff. Clara held it as carefully as she had held the business card the night before. Look at that, she said. A name can carry a person a long way when people finally use it right. Annie laughed softly, then wiped her eye before the tear could fall. Don't start. I have earned the right to start. They warmed canned soup for dinner, and Clara insisted on opening the better crackers she had been saving. Annie protested until Clara tapped the box against the table. We are not celebrating with stale crackers when the good ones are sitting right there. It's just a trial position. It is a door with your foot in it. That counts. After dinner, Annie washed the bowls while Clara sat nearby, studying the schedule again. The older woman had a way of reading ordinary paper as if it contained weather reports from the future. You'll have to go back to Marcus's place, Clara said. Annie's hands paused in the sink. I know. For your card papers, maybe your final check. If there is one. Clara's mouth tightened. That man owes you money. Annie rinsed a spoon. He owes a lot of people. The truth sat between them. The next morning, Annie reported to the foundation at 8:30. By 10, she had helped Helen correct another delivery list. By noon, she was packing food boxes in a small warehouse space below the main office. Canned beans, pasta, rice, peanut butter, oatmeal, shelf-stable milk. Helen showed her how to check expiration dates, balance heavy items on the bottom, and mark boxes for households with dietary notes. Annie worked fast, but not carelessly. Helen noticed. You've packed boxes before? No. You sure? Annie placed a jar of peanut butter between 2 bags of rice so it would not roll. I've carried groceries on buses. You learn what breaks. Helen nodded. Useful education. Near the end of the day, Helen handed her a stack of returned forms. These need calls. Some numbers won't work. Some people may be short with you. Don't take it personally. Annie sat at a desk and began dialing. The first number was disconnected. The second went to voicemail. The third was answered by a man who sounded suspicious. The second, she mentioned assistance. I already told y'all I can't come downtown, he said. I'm not asking you to, Annie replied. I'm calling to fix your delivery address. There was a pause. You people said I missed pickup. I see that note. I also see you don't have transportation. That should have been marked differently. Who is this? My name is Annie Brooks. I'm with Whitmore Foundation. He was quiet for a moment. You knew? Yes, sir. Thought so. You sound like you actually read the form. Annie smiled despite herself. I'm trying. By Friday morning, she had learned the supply room, the intake desk, the delivery map, and the coffee machine that only worked if someone pressed the side with their palm. She had also learned that office people could be kind and still miss obvious things because they had never had to live inside the problems they were trying to solve. At 3 that afternoon, Annie was sorting donated hygiene kits when Rachel came downstairs with a sealed envelope. Annie? Annie turned. Rachel held it out. Your first check. Payroll wasn't able to set up direct deposit in time, so we issued paper. For a second, Annie could not move. Helen looked over from the packing table but said nothing. Annie wiped her hand on her jeans before taking the envelope. It felt too light to be as important as it was. Her name was printed on the front. Not delayed. Not promised. Not next week. Paid. You can open it, Rachel said gently. Annie slid her finger under the flap. The amount was for the partial week. Modest but real. Taxes had been taken out, hours listed, rate listed, everything written plainly where no one could move it around later. Her vision blurred. Helen cleared her throat and looked down at her clipboard, giving Annie privacy without leaving her alone. Rachel said, "Credit union closes at 5. They're expecting you." Annie nodded, but her voice came out rough. "Thank you." When she left the building that evening, she did not go straight home. She stopped first at the credit union and opened the smallest checking account they offered. Then she went to a pharmacy near the bus line and bought Clara's medicine. At the register, when the total appeared, Annie braced herself out of habit. Then she remembered the check had cleared enough for a starter deposit and cash back. She paid without asking the cashier to remove anything. Outside, she stood under the awning with the pharmacy bag in one hand and her receipt in the other. It was not wealth. It was not safety forever. It was not the end of fear, but it was money she had earned and received when someone said she would. On the bus home, Annie held the pharmacy bag on her lap. Across the aisle, a tired woman in scrubs closed her eyes between stops. A man in a work jacket rubbed paint from his fingers. An older veteran counted change in his palm. Annie looked at them and thought of Marcus Reed. She thought of hot machines, wet sheets, missing paychecks, and the way people swallowed anger because rent was due. The next day, she would have to go back to the laundry service to ask for what she was owed. The thought made her stomach tighten, but this time, she would not go there empty-handed. She had a badge in her bag, a paycheck receipt in her pocket, and the beginning of a voice she was no longer willing to bury. Saturday morning came with a pale sun and a wind sharp enough to make Annie pull her jacket tight around her. She stood across the street from the industrial laundry service with Clara's words still in her ears. "Ask for what you earned. Do not ask like it is a favor." The building looked worse in daylight than it had during late shifts. Gray walls, loading docks, rust near the gutters, delivery trucks backed against wide metal doors. Steam drifted from a vent near the roof. Inside, machines turned all day, swallowing sheets from hotels where guests slept on clean cotton without ever knowing whose hands had washed it. Annie waited until a truck pulled away, then crossed the street. The front office smelled like detergent, paper, and burnt coffee. A plastic plant sat in the corner beside a stack of outdated safety posters. Behind the counter, Carla from payroll was typing with one hand and eating crackers with the other. She looked up and blinked. "Annie? Morning. You working today?" "No. I came to ask about my check." Carla's face changed in the tired way of someone who had heard the same question too many times and had no good answer. "Marcus is in." "I figured." Carla lowered her voice. "You sure you want to do this today?" Annie's fingers tightened around the strap of her bag. "I worked the hours. I need the pay." Carla glanced toward the inner office. "I know." The words were small, but they carried something heavy. Annie caught it and held on. "Is he busy?" she asked. "He'll say he is. Then I'll wait." Carla looked at her for a second, then pressed the intercom. "Marcus, Annie Brooks is here." A pause. Then Marcus Reed's voice came through, flat and annoyed. "Send her in." Annie walked down the short hallway. She could hear the machines through the walls, a constant metal breathing. The sound had lived in her bones for 6 months. It had followed her home in the evenings, humming inside her head while she tried to sleep. Marcus sat behind his desk with his sleeves rolled up and his phone in his hand. A framed certificate hung crooked behind him. He did not stand. "Well," he said, "look who found time to come back." Annie stopped in front of the desk. "I'm here for my paycheck." Marcus gave a short laugh through his nose. "Good morning to you too." "Good morning. I'm here for my paycheck." His smile thinned. "Payroll is still processing." "It was processing 2 weeks ago. That's how delays work. I worked 61 hours over that pay period. 8 of those were overtime." Marcus set the phone down. "You keeping records now?" "Yes." That bothered him. She saw it. He leaned back in his chair, then caught himself and leaned forward instead, elbows on the desk. "Let me explain something, Annie. You walked off schedule." "I didn't walk off. I finished my shift." "You didn't come back." "Because I found another job." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "That rich man from the other night?" Annie went still. He smiled slightly. "Atlanta's smaller than you think." "People talk." Her throat tightened, but she kept her voice even. "My paycheck has nothing to do with where I work now. It has everything to do with attitude. You girls come in here, Want steady hours, want understanding. Then the second somebody waves a little opportunity around, you forget who gave you work. Annie felt the old instinct rise. Apologize, shrink, make it easier, leave, before it became worse. She pressed her thumb against the side of her bag until the feeling passed. You didn't give me work, she said. I sold you my time. Marcus's face hardened. For a moment, only the machines spoke through the walls. He opened a drawer, pulled out a folder, and flipped through papers with more force than needed. There may be deductions. For what? Uniform damage, missed shift, late return of badge. My uniform was already used when you gave it to me. I didn't miss a scheduled shift. And the badge is in my bag. Polizei's policy. Then show it to me. Marcus looked up. Excuse me? Show me the policy I signed that says you can deduct 2 weeks of pay because I got another job. His mouth tightened. You've changed. No, Annie said quietly. I got paid on time yesterday. It reminded me what normal feels like. The words landed clean. Marcus stood. You need to watch yourself. The door behind Annie opened before she could answer. Carla stepped in, holding a stack of envelopes. Sorry, she said, though she did not sound sorry. The courier needs signatures for the hotel linen pickup. Marcus snapped. Not now. Carla looked at Annie, then back at Marcus. Also, 3 more people are asking about checks. Tell them what I told everybody else. They're tired of being told. Marcus's eyes flashed. Carla. She pressed the envelopes against her chest. I'm just saying. Annie realized then that the room was not as sealed as Marcus wanted it to be. Outside the door, someone had stopped in the hallway. Maybe more than one person. Marcus noticed too. His voice lowered. You want to make a scene? No. Annie said. I want my pay. He stared at her, then pulled one envelope from the folder and tossed it onto the desk. It slid toward the edge but did not fall. There, take it. Annie picked it up but did not put it away. She opened it in front of him. The check was there, but the amount was wrong. This is short. Marcus looked bored. Deductions. For what? I told you. And I asked you to show me. He stepped around the desk, closer now. You think because you met Edward Whitmore, you're untouchable? Annie's stomach turned at the sound of Edward's name in Marcus's mouth. No, she said. I think because I worked those hours, I should be paid for them. Marcus leaned toward her. Listen carefully. Men like Whitmore collect sad stories. They shake a hand, write a card, maybe let you sit in a lobby. Then they move on. Don't mistake being useful for being valued. The words hit harder than she expected, because they carried the exact fear she had tried not to name. Carla shifted near the door. Marcus, that's enough. He turned on her. Get back to your desk. Annie folded the short check and placed it in her bag. Her hands were cold, but steady. I'll be asking for the rest in writing, she said. Marcus laughed once. You do that. I will. She turned to leave. Annie, he said. She stopped but did not face him. If you start trouble, don't come crying when those people downtown decide you're more problem than charity case. For 1 second, shame burned up the back of her neck. Then she thought of the food boxes at the foundation, of Helen's pencil tapping the map, of Clara dividing rescued bread onto 2 plates, of Edward saying no one should make her apologize for hunger. Annie turned around. I'm not charity, she said, and wanting my paycheck is not trouble. Carla's eyes lowered, but Annie saw the corner of her mouth move, almost a smile. Annie walked out past the front counter. 2 workers stood near the time clock. Daryl from loading and Maria from folding. Both looked away at first. Then Daryl spoke. You got yours? Part of it, Annie said. Maria's face tightened. They shorted you too? Annie met her eyes. Yes. Daryl muttered something under his breath. Maria folded her arms. He told me my overtime didn't count because I switched shifts with Tanya. That's not right, Annie said. No, Daryl said. It ain't. The 3 of them stood there with the machines roaring behind the wall and a line of laundry carts waiting near the loading door. For the first time, Annie understood that her hunger had not been a private failure. It had been one piece of a larger theft, quiet enough to look like paperwork. Maria lowered her voice. So what do we do? Annie did not have a full answer. Not yet. But she had a check, even a short one. She had names. She had hours written in a notebook. She had Edward's card and Helen's office number. Most of all, she had the strange new knowledge that asking for what was owed did not make her ungrateful. She looked at Maria, then Daryl. "Start writing everything down," Annie said. "Hours, dates, what he says, what he pays. Don't trust memory when people are counting on us to forget." Daryl nodded slowly. Maria looked toward Marcus's closed door. "He's not going to like that." Annie took a breath. "No," she said, "he's not." When she stepped outside, the wind hit her face, but she did not pull away from it. Across the lot, a delivery truck rolled out carrying clean linens toward another hotel, another bright lobby, another room where no one would think about the people behind the sheets. Annie watched it go, then took out her phone and called the number Rachel had given her. When Helen answered, Annie said, "I went back for my check." Helen's voice sharpened. "And? They paid part of it. But? And I think I'm not the only one." There was a short silence. Then Helen said, "Come in Monday with whatever you have." Annie looked back at the laundry building, at the steam rising from the roof like a secret trying to escape. "I will," she said. "And Helen?" "Yes?" "I wrote things down." "Good," Helen said. "Paper has a way of making people nervous when they've been lying out loud." Annie ended the call and tucked the phone away. She still felt afraid. But fear had changed shape. It no longer stood in front of her like a wall. It had moved beside her. Something she would have to carry for a while, but not something she had to obey. Then she started toward the bus stop, the short check in her bag and the first thread of a much larger truth beginning to follow her home. Monday morning, Annie arrived at Whitmore Foundation with the short check folded inside an envelope, her old time cards copied by hand, and 3 names written on the back of a grocery receipt: Maria Lewis, Daryl Watkins, and Tanya Price. She had not slept much Sunday night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Marcus's office, the envelope sliding across the desk, the look on his face when she said she would ask for the rest in writing. Helen was already at the operations table, sorting delivery sheets with a cup of coffee beside her. She looked up once and saw Annie's face. "Conference room," Helen said. Annie followed her into a small room with a round table, 4 chairs, and a window facing the loading area below. Helen closed the door but did not sit right away. "Before you hand me anything," Helen said, "I need you to know what happens next. If this is only about your missing wages, we help you file a claim and get what you're owed. If this is bigger, and it sounds bigger, then we bring in legal. We document everything. We do not guess. We do not exaggerate. We do not let anger make sloppy work." Annie nodded. "I understand. And you don't have to be the face of it." Annie looked down at the envelope. "I already feel like I am." Helen's face softened, but only a little. Feeling that way and agreeing to it are 2 different things. Annie placed the envelope on the table. "I want the truth out, but I don't want people losing their jobs because of me. If they lose jobs because someone stole wages, that is not because of you. It won't feel that way to them." "No," Helen said. "It probably won't." That honesty steadied Annie more than comfort would have. Helen opened the envelope and spread the papers across the table. She looked at the check, then the handwritten hours, then the list of names. Her mouth tightened. "You wrote dates?" "Yes." "Start times?" "When I remembered." "Overtime?" "I marked the days I stayed late." Helen tapped one entry. "Who approved this shift?" "Marcus. He said the hotel order was short and had to go out before morning." "Any message?" Annie pulled out her phone. "One text from him. It says, 'Need you to stay.' No excuses." Helen's eyebrows lifted. "That will help." Annie almost laughed. It didn't feel helpful at the time. It rarely does when evidence is being created. By 9:30, Helen had asked Edward to join them. He entered without ceremony, carrying a legal pad instead of a laptop. Annie started to stand, but he waved her back into her chair. "Miss Brooks," he said, "Helen tells me Marcus paid you short." "Yes, sir." "May I see?" She pushed the check copy toward him. Edward read it, then read her handwritten hours. His expression did not change quickly. It closed slowly, like a door being shut with care. "This is not a payroll delay," he said. Helen nodded. "No, this is wage trimming." Edward looked at Annie. "You said others may have the same issue." "Maria told me her overtime didn't count." "Daryl is missing hours." "Tanya switched shifts and got penalized, I think." "There are more." but I don't know who will talk. Edward leaned back in his chair, not in comfort, but to create room between his anger and his next words. Then we find out properly. Annie hesitated. Mr. Whitmore, I don't want trouble for the people still there. Neither do I. That is why this needs to be handled carefully. Helen said, we need payroll records, contract records, and the chain of payment. Edward's eyes shifted to her. The laundry service. Do we know who they serve? Hotels, Annie said. Mostly hotels. Some restaurants. I don't know all the names. Edward turned to Helen. Pull every foundation vendor list and cross-check any service contracts tied to laundry or linens. Helen gave him a look. The foundation doesn't use them. No, but Whitmore Holdings might. So might our partners. Annie's stomach tightened. You think your company works with Marcus? I don't know, Edward said, but I intend to. That afternoon, Annie tried to return to regular work, but the delivery lists blurred in front of her. Helen noticed and moved her to inventory, where counting gave her hands something to do. Canned vegetables, rice bags, oatmeal, hygiene kits, numbers that helped people instead of hiding what they were owed. Near lunch, Edward called Nathan Cole. Annie was not in the room, but Helen told her later that the conversation had been short. Nathan, Edward had said, I need every subcontractor tied to your hotel linen services in Georgia. Nathan, from wherever he was taking the call, had laughed once. Good morning to you too. I'm not joking. What happened? I may have found a wage problem. That's serious. Yes, send the list. By late afternoon, Nathan had sent the first documents. Edward's legal team began reviewing them. A company name appeared twice, then 3 times. Reed Commercial Laundry Services. Marcus's company. Edward stood in his office with the pages in his hand while Rachel waited near the door. How long have we been indirectly tied to them? He asked. Rachel checked the summary. Through Cole Hospitality's subcontracting chain, at least 18 months. Edward looked out over Atlanta. Trucks moved below like small pieces on a board. Somewhere in that city, workers were sorting linens for hotel beds they could not afford to sleep in, waiting for wages that had already been paid down the chain. Schedule Nathan for tomorrow, Edward said. In person. Yes, sir. And bring in legal. Rachel nodded, then paused. Should I tell Miss Brooks? Edward turned back. Not yet. Not until we know what we can prove. But Annie knew something had shifted. She saw it in the way Helen took calls behind closed doors, in the way Edward came downstairs twice and left with papers, in the way Rachel walked faster than usual through the foundation office. By Tuesday morning, everyone seemed to be speaking around a storm. Annie kept working. She called families whose food deliveries had failed. She corrected addresses. She packed boxes. She marked one elderly man's delivery for a late afternoon drop because he had dialysis in the morning. She did the work in front of her because it was the only way to keep from imagining Marcus finding out and coming after everyone. At noon, Helen brought her a sandwich from the staff kitchen. Eat, Helen said. I'm not hungry. That may be true, or it may be nerves talking. Either way, eat half. Annie took the sandwich. You sound like Clara. Then Clara is a wise woman. She is. Helen sat across from her. Edward found the laundry service in a subcontractor chain. Annie's hand stopped halfway to the sandwich. So his company, not directly, but close enough that he is angry. Annie put the sandwich down. I didn't mean to bring this to his door. Helen leaned forward. Annie. It was already at his door. You just made him open it. The words stayed with her. That evening, Edward met Nathan Cole in a private conference room. Nathan arrived in a navy coat, carrying a leather folder and the confidence of a man used to solving expensive problems. He lost some of that confidence when Edward placed Annie's short check on the table. This came from Reed Commercial Laundry, Edward said. Nathan looked at it. One employee? One we know by name. Others are likely. Nathan's mouth tightened. Marcus Reed has been difficult, but his rates are low and turnaround is fast. Low rates often mean someone else is paying the difference. Nathan did not answer. Edward slid another document across the table. Your hotels paid the vendor on time. Yes. Then why are workers waiting 2 weeks for wages? Nathan looked at the pages longer this time. I'll authorize a full review. No, Edward said. You will participate in one. Nathan looked up. Edward's voice stayed calm. If our businesses benefit from subcontractors who underpay workers, we do not get to act surprised from a distance. We look, we verify, we fix what we can, and we cut loose what refuses to be fixed. Nathan slowly closed his folder. You're serious? I watched a young woman pull bread from a trash bin because her paycheck was late. Yes, Nathan. I am serious. By Wednesday, the review had widened. Payroll summaries, delivery logs, hotel invoices, overtime sheets. The numbers did not line up. Not by accident. Too many workers had identical deductions. Too many overtime hours vanished under vague codes. Too many payments from hotels arrived before wages were delayed. Helen explained it to Annie in plain words. He had the money, Helen said. He just did not pay people correctly. Annie sat very still. She had imagined many reasons for her hunger. Bad timing, bad luck, a payroll error, her own failure to save enough. But this was different. Someone had looked at money she earned and decided to keep part of it, trusting she would be too tired or too afraid to fight. Her eyes burned, but no tears came. Helen watched her. What are you thinking? Annie looked through the office window at the boxes stacked for Friday delivery. I'm thinking, she said, that I almost apologized to him. Helen said nothing. I stood in that office with my own paycheck missing, and I almost apologized for asking. Helen's voice lowered. That is how people like Marcus stay powerful. Annie folded her hands together until they stopped shaking. Then he shouldn't stay powerful. By the end of the week, Edward had authorized legal outreach to former and current employees, confidentially and carefully. No public accusation yet, no careless claims, just questions, records, and a promise that anyone who came forward would be heard. On Friday afternoon, Annie received her second paycheck from Whitmore Foundation. It arrived exactly when Rachel said it would. The amount was correct. The hours matched. Nothing mysterious had vanished. She held the pay stub for a long time. Then she placed it beside the short check from Marcus. One piece of paper showed what work was worth when people honored it. The other showed what happened when they did not. Annie looked at both and understood that the story was no longer only about the night Edward found her beside the trash bin. That night had been the visible wound. The deeper sickness was written in records, contracts, deductions, and quiet fear. And now, for the first time, someone with power was reading the fine print. The first calls came in quietly, not through a headline, not through a protest, not through anyone raising a hand in public. They came through a phone line Rachel had set up under the name of Whitmore's legal department, with a message that said workers connected to Reed Commercial Laundry could speak confidentially about wage concerns. The wording was careful. Helen said careful words protected frightened people. Annie understood that. Frightened people often needed a plain door, not a spotlight. On Monday morning, Helen placed a small stack of message slips on the operations table. 4 calls over the weekend, she said. Annie looked up from the delivery route she was marking. From Reed, 2 current employees, 1 former, 1 person who wouldn't leave a name. Annie's pencil stopped. Helen sat across from her. You don't have to be part of this. I know. I mean it. You have work here. You are not required to carry everyone else's fear. Annie looked down at the map. A red circle marked an apartment building where a disabled veteran needed a porch drop. A blue mark showed a woman who worked nights and could not answer morning calls. Annie had spent the early part of the morning changing delivery times because the system had treated everyone as if they lived the same life. I already know what their fear sounds like, she said. Helen did not argue. Then you can sit in, but you don't lead. Legal leads. You listen only if the caller agrees. By 10, Edward had brought in a labor attorney named Patricia Wells. She was in her late 50s, with close-cut gray hair, a navy suit, and a voice that made even simple sentences feel properly filed. Patricia greeted Annie with a handshake and no surprise in her eyes, which Annie appreciated. I've read your summary, Patricia said. Annie stiffened. My summary? The hours you wrote down. The short check. The text message from your former manager. Patricia opened a folder. Good documentation. Not perfect, but honest. Honest is useful. Annie sat a little straighter. The first employee to come in person was Maria Lewis, the woman from folding. She arrived during lunch break, wearing her work shoes and a sweatshirt with detergent dust on one sleeve. She did not sit until Helen offered twice. I can't be gone long, Maria said. Marcus checks. Patricia kept her tone even. You are free to leave at any time. We're here to understand what happened, not force you into anything. Maria looked at Annie. You trust them? Annie thought before answering. I trust Helen. I trust what's written on paper. I'm still learning the rest. Edward, who stood near the window, gave no sign that the answer offended him. If anything, he seemed to respect it. Maria pulled folded papers from her purse. These are my hours. I started taking pictures of the time clock after they shorted me in March. Patricia put on her glasses. May I copy these? As long as my name doesn't get back to him yet. It won't without your permission. Maria's shoulders lowered a fraction. He says overtime don't count if we switch shifts, but he's the one who tells us to switch. Annie felt the old heat in the back of her throat. Marcus had done the same to Tanya, maybe to others. He made people bend to cover the work, then punished them for bending. Edward asked, did he put that in writing? Maria gave a tired laugh. Men like Marcus don't write down the ugly part. Patricia looked up. Sometimes they do by accident. Maria pulled out her phone. By the end of the meeting, they had 3 texts, 2 time clock photos, and a story that matched Annie's almost exactly. When Maria left, she paused at the door. Annie, she said. Yes? I thought you were just lucky when you got out. Annie did not know what to say. Maria shifted her purse higher on her shoulder. Maybe you were, but maybe we needed one person to get out so somebody could talk from the other side. After she left, Annie went to the restroom and stood by the sink for a full minute without turning on the water. The other side. She did not feel like she was on the other side. She still counted every dollar. She still saved half her lunch. She still carried Marcus's voice in the back of her mind. But Maria had looked at her like she had crossed a line in the road and might be able to call back. When Annie returned, Edward was waiting near the hallway. You all right? He asked. I don't know. That is allowed. She leaned one shoulder against the wall, tired of pretending the day had not reached inside her. Maria has more proof than I did. She was scared anyway. Proof does not erase fear. No. It just gives fear somewhere to stand. Edward nodded slowly. That's a good way to put it. Annie looked toward the conference room. How many people do you think he did this to? Edward's face tightened, enough that he stopped worrying about being caught. That answer stayed with her. Over the next 3 days, the stories came in pieces. Daryl came after his shift, smelling of machine oil and laundry steam. He had lost overtime hours during a hotel rush, then been told he should be grateful Marcus kept him on after he injured his shoulder. Tanya called from a parking lot and cried quietly while explaining that she had worked 2 doubles and still could not pay her power bill on time. A former employee named Ruth said she quit after Marcus delayed her check twice, but she never filed anything because she thought no one would care. Patricia did not rush them. She asked dates, amounts, names, messages, witnesses. Edward listened more than he spoke. Helen took notes. Annie sat with her hands folded and learned how large silence could become when everyone had been carrying the same kind. On Thursday afternoon, Annie helped pack emergency food boxes while the legal team worked upstairs. She was sealing a box of rice, beans, soup, and oatmeal when a man stepped into the foundation office wearing a Whitmore security badge. Miss Brooks? Annie turned. Yes? There's someone downstairs asking for you. Says his name is Daryl Watkins. He doesn't want to come up. Helen came out of her office. Is something wrong? I don't know, the guard said. He looks upset. Annie was already moving. Daryl stood just inside the building entrance, cap in his hands, eyes fixed on the floor. The lobby around him made him look uncomfortable, as if he expected someone to tell him his boots were tracking in too much of the world outside. Annie stopped a few feet away. Daryl? He looked up. Marcus knows. Her stomach dropped. What happened? He called 3 of us into the office after lunch, said somebody's been spreading lies, said if any of us talked to lawyers, there might not be shifts next week. Helen, who had followed Annie, stepped closer. Did he name anyone? Daryl looked at Annie, then away. He named you. The lobby seemed to narrow. What did he say? Annie asked. Daryl rubbed the cap between his hands. Said you were bitter. Said you ran to a rich man with a sob story. Said people like you always know how to make trouble sound like justice. Helen's mouth tightened. Did anyone record it? Daryl shook his head. No, but Maria heard. Tanya too. Edward came out of the elevator then. Likely called by security. He took in Daryl, Annie, Helen, and the look on all their faces. What happened? Helen answered. Retaliation threat. Edward's expression changed. Daryl lifted his hands. I'm not trying to get in the middle of rich folks' business. I just need my job. Edward walked toward him. Not too close. Mr. Watkins, this is not rich folks' business. This is your wages, your hours, and your right not to be threatened for telling the truth. Daryl's eyes flicked toward Annie. That sounds good in a lobby. Annie felt the sting of it, but she understood. A lobby was not a rent notice. It was not a refrigerator. It was not Marcus deciding who got next week's hours. Edward understood too. You're right, he said. Words in a lobby are cheap, so here is what we can do. Patricia Wells will document what you just told us. If Marcus cuts shifts after learning workers spoke about wages, that becomes part of the case. If you want, we can also connect you with emergency support if hours disappear. Daryl looked doubtful. Support doesn't replace a job. No, Edward said. But fear of losing a job is how men like Marcus steal from people who earned their pay. The sentence hung there. Daryl looked down at his cap again. I can talk to the lawyer, but I don't want my name out there yet. You control that, Edward said. Annie watched Daryl follow Helen toward the conference room. A week ago, Daryl had stood by the time clock asking what they should do. Now he was inside Whitmore's building, still afraid, but speaking. Edward remained beside Annie. I'm sorry he named you, he said. Annie stared toward the conference room doors. He was always going to. Yes, I thought I'd feel braver by now. Edward's voice was quiet. Bravery rarely feels like bravery while it's happening. She let out a breath that almost became a laugh. Then what does it feel like? Usually. He looked toward the elevator where Daryl had come in carrying fear like an unpaid bill. Like wanting to go home. Annie nodded because that was exactly how it felt. That evening, Helen drove Annie home so she would not have to take the bus alone after Marcus's threat. Annie protested once, then accepted. The car was plain, full of file folders, reusable grocery bags, and a travel mug that had seen better days. Helen drove with both hands on the wheel. You don't have to be fearless tomorrow, Helen said. I know. You also don't have to be noble every minute. Annie looked out the window. What if people lose hours before this is fixed? Then we help them. What if they blame me? Some might. Annie turned to her. Helen did not soften the answer. People in pain do not always aim carefully. But Marcus caused this. Not you. When Annie reached Clara's apartment, the older woman was waiting with tea, and the look of someone who had already guessed the day had been hard. Annie told her everything. Marcus naming her. Daryl coming to the building. The threats. Clara listened without interrupting. Then she placed one hand over Annie's. Child. A crooked floor always blames the first person who says the house is leaning. Annie closed her eyes. I'm tired. I know. I'm scared. I know that too. What if I started something I can't finish? Clara squeezed her hand. Then you don't finish it alone. The next morning, Annie arrived at the foundation early. On her desk sat a folded note from Helen. Maria called. She is willing to speak again. Tanya, too. Daryl signed a statement. Annie stood with the note in her hand while the office began to wake around her. Coffee brewing. Phones ringing. Boxes being opened. People saying good morning like the world had not shifted under their feet. She placed the note beside her pay stub from Whitmore and the short check from Marcus. 3 papers. One showed respect. One showed theft. One showed courage beginning to spread. Annie picked up her pencil and returned to the delivery list. There were still people waiting for food that afternoon. Justice might be coming, but hunger did not pause for legal work. So Annie did what she had learned to do. She kept moving. One name, one address, one truth at a time. By the end of that week, the foundation office had learned to recognize the sound of trouble before anyone named it. It came in the shorter phone calls, the closed doors, the way Helen took off her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose before speaking. Annie noticed all of it. She had spent too much of her life reading rooms to miss what people tried to hide inside them. Friday afternoon, Edward asked her to come upstairs. Helen walked with her to the elevator but did not get in. You'll be fine, she said. Annie looked at her. You know what this is about? I know enough. That is not comforting. Helen gave her the kind of look Clara used when Annie tried to dodge the truth. Comfort is overrated. Clarity is better. The elevator doors opened. Annie stepped inside alone. On the 36th floor, Rachel met her near the reception desk. They're in conference room B. They? Mr. Whitmore, Mr. Cole, Patricia Wells, and two people from compliance. Annie's stomach tightened. Nathan Cole's name made the matter feel larger than Marcus's office, larger than the time clock, larger than her short check. This was the part where powerful people looked at paperwork and decided how much a poor person's suffering was worth. Rachel noticed her pause. You don't have to perform for them. Annie nodded, though she was not sure she believed it. Inside the conference room, Edward stood when she entered. Nathan Cole sat beside a folder thick with printed contracts. Patricia Wells had a yellow pad full of notes. Two compliance officers had laptops open, but both looked up as Annie came in. Miss Brooks, Edward said, thank you for coming. Annie sat in the chair nearest the door because it felt easier to breathe there. Nathan leaned forward. He was younger than Edward, maybe mid-40s, dressed well but not loudly. His face held the careful concern of someone who had just discovered a fire in a building he owned on paper but had never walked through. Annie, he said, I'm Nathan Cole. My company works with several hotels that used Reed Commercial Laundry through a subcontracting chain. I want to say I'm sorry for what happened. Annie looked at him for a moment. Did you know? The room went still. Nathan did not answer quickly. No. But you paid them? We paid the vendor above them. Reed was brought in under that contract. So the money was there? Nathan's jaw tightened. Yes. Annie nodded slowly. Then I don't need sorry first. I need to understand how money can travel through that many hands and disappear before it reaches the people who earned it. Edward's eyes lowered to the table. Not in shame exactly, but in recognition. Patricia spoke. That is what we're trying to establish. The preliminary records show Reed received payment on schedule for multiple hotel linen contracts. Payroll delays appear to have happened after funds were available, meaning Marcus had the money, Annie said. Yes, Patricia replied. One of the compliance officers turned his laptop slightly. We also found repeated deductions under vague codes, uniform recovery, schedule adjustment, processing hold. The same codes appear across multiple workers. Annie thought of Marcus's voice. Policy is policy. She could almost smell his burnt coffee. Nathan opened his folder. There's more. Reed's low rates helped keep service costs down. My team accepted those rates without asking enough questions about how he managed them. Annie looked at him. Because low prices sound good when you're not the one paying for them. No one spoke for a second. Nathan nodded. Yes. Edward leaned forward. This is no longer only about getting your missing pay. We are preparing to demand a full wage review for everyone affected. But we need more workers willing to document hours, checks, texts, anything they have. Annie folded her hands. They're scared. We know, Patricia said. That's why we're setting up confidential appointments. Marcus already threatened ours. That has been documented. If he retaliates, it strengthens the case. Annie looked at Patricia. It may strengthen the case later. It still hurts people now. Patricia accepted that without defense. You're right. Legal remedies are often slow. That's why Mr. Whitmore asked us to pair this with emergency support, Edward said. Any worker who loses hours after speaking with us can apply for temporary assistance through the foundation. Food, transportation, utilities, rent referrals. It won't solve everything, but it may keep people from being trapped by fear. Annie looked down at the table. A week earlier, she had been afraid to accept breakfast. Now they were discussing a response for workers who had been carrying the same fear she had. The shift felt too large to trust. What do you need from me? She asked. Edward answered carefully. Only what you are willing to give. You can help us understand the workplace, who may be trusted, who may need protection, what Marcus says when he thinks no one important is listening. But I do not want you used. Annie almost smiled at that, but there was no humor in it. People like me get used without anyone calling it that. Edward did not flinch. Then call it when you see it. Even here. She looked at him, trying to decide whether a man like him understood the weight of that invitation. Maybe he did. Maybe he was learning. Rachel knocked once and opened the door. Mr. Whitmore, Helen is downstairs with Maria Lewis. She says Maria brought 2 more employees. Patricia closed her folder. Good. Annie stood. I should go down. Edward looked at her. You don't have to. I know. Annie took a breath. But if they came because I did, I should at least be there when they walk in. Downstairs, the foundation office had shifted into a kind of quiet readiness. Helen stood near the entrance with Maria, Daryl, and a woman Annie recognized from the pressing line named Tanya. Tanya's eyes were red, and she held a phone in both hands like it might break if she loosened her grip. Maria saw Annie first. You okay? Annie nodded. Are you? Maria huffed. No, but I'm here. Tanya looked at the elevators. Is he upstairs? Whitmore? Yes, Annie said. But you'll talk to Patricia first. She's the attorney. Nobody's going to force you. Daryl muttered. That's what everybody says. Helen stepped in. Then let me say something different. You may leave at any point. You may refuse any question. You may ask for a break. You may decide not to sign anything today. The only thing we ask is that if you speak, you tell the truth as plainly as you can. Tanya looked at Annie. Did it help when you told? Annie thought of the night after the video had not yet happened, the fear that still lived in her ribs, the short check, the first real paycheck, Edward's card, Clara's hand over hers. It didn't make me less scared, she said, but it made me less alone. Tanya's mouth trembled. I can do less alone. Patricia came down with Nathan and Edward a few minutes later. Nathan stayed back. Edward did too. Patricia led the workers into the conference room, while Helen brought water and closed the door. Annie returned to her desk, but she could not focus on the delivery list. Through the glass, she could see shapes moving, heads bowed, hands lifting phones, papers being passed across the table. She could not hear their words, but she knew the rhythm. A person trying to tell the truth without falling apart. An hour later, Maria came out first. She wiped her cheeks with her sleeve and looked angry about having cried. He took more than I thought, she said. Annie stood. How much? Maria shook her head. Enough that I could have fixed my car before it got towed. Daryl came next. Face tight. Cap in hand. They said my shoulder thing might matter too. He cut my hours after I complained. Tanya did not come out for several minutes. When she finally did, Edward walked behind her at a respectful distance. Tanya held a tissue in one hand and her phone in the other. He wrote it, she said to Annie, voice thin. He actually wrote it. Told me if I wanted my overtime, I should learn to be more flexible. Patricia followed. That message is important. Helen looked toward Edward. How many more? Patricia answered. If the pattern holds, many. Nathan exhaled hard. I'm suspending new work with Reed, pending review. Edward's voice was quiet. Not enough. Nathan turned to him. Suspension protects your company, Edward said. Restitution protects the workers. Nathan absorbed that. We'll fund the payroll audit. And back pay? If the audit confirms it, yes. Annie watched the exchange. Two men in expensive suits discussing money that had once been invisible because it belonged to people who folded sheets and loaded trucks. For the first time, she understood how power sounded when it was forced to answer a plain question. That evening, after the workers left, Annie found Edward standing in the foundation loading area, looking at rows of packed food boxes. Mr. Whitmore? He turned. Did you ever think about where hotel sheets came from? She asked. He gave a tired smile without amusement. Not enough. Most people don't. No, he said. Most people enjoy clean things without asking who got dirty making them clean. Annie looked at the boxes. Marcus counted on that. Edward nodded. So did everyone who benefited from not asking. That was the first time Annie heard him place blame near himself. Not the same blame Marcus carried, but a responsibility he could no longer set down. What happens now? She asked. Now we gather enough that he can't call it one mistake. And if he still does? Edward's face hardened. Then we make sure the room is too full of truth for his lie to breathe. Annie held those words on the bus ride home. The city passed outside in streaks of light, and for once she did not feel like the only person awake to what had happened. Behind office doors and conference glass, the story had begun to grow legs. It was walking now, slowly, carefully, toward Marcus Reed. By Monday, Marcus Reed had stopped pretending the matter would fade on its own. He did not call it fear. Men like Marcus rarely did. He called it discipline. He called it protecting the business. He called it keeping people from spreading lies. But by 8 in the morning, Every worker at Reed Commercial Laundry could feel the change. The building seemed tighter. The floor supervisors watched longer. The time clock had a new sign taped above it. Any employee found sharing internal company information may face immediate termination. Maria took a picture of the sign before her shift. Daryl saw her do it and whispered, "You trying to get fired?" Maria slid the phone into her pocket. "No, I'm trying to remember what he said when he lies about it later." Across the room, machines ran hot. Sheets moved through rollers, towels dropped into carts. Steam clouded the lights overhead. Marcus walked the floor with a clipboard, not because he needed to inspect anything, but because he wanted everyone to know he was there. At 10:15, he called Tanya into his office. At 10:30, she came out pale and quiet. Maria caught her near the folding tables. "What happened?" Tanya shook her head. Later, "Did he threaten you?" Tanya's hands worked at the edge of a towel. "He said my schedule might be reduced. Said business is slow." Maria looked around at the carts stacked near the washers. "Business is not slow." "No," Tanya said, "it's not." By lunchtime, 3 workers had received new schedules with fewer hours. Daryl lost a Saturday shift. Maria lost 2 evening hours. Tanya lost almost an entire day. None of it was written as punishment. It was written as operational adjustment, the kind of language that made cruelty look like office work. At Whitmore Foundation, Annie heard about it from Maria during her lunch break. She answered the call behind the supply shelves. One hand pressed to her ear to block out the noise of volunteers packing boxes. "He cut hours?" Annie asked. "Mine, Daryl's, Tanya's, maybe more. He's smiling like he just cleaned a stain out of a shirt." Annie closed her eyes. "I'm sorry. Don't you start that," Maria said sharply. "I didn't call for sorry. I called because you told us to write things down." "We did. You have pictures, schedules, sign, texts. Tanya has one where he says if people want stable hours, they should stop creating outside problems." Annie's grip tightened around the phone. "Send everything to Patricia." "We are. But Annie?" "Yeah?" Maria's voice lowered. "Some people are getting scared. They're saying maybe we should have stayed quiet." Annie leaned her shoulder against the shelf. A box of oatmeal sat open beside her, the smell dry and plain. "I don't blame them. I know. But I need to hear you say something other than that." Annie looked through the shelves at the foundation floor. Helen was correcting a delivery note. A volunteer was taping a food box shut. Edward was not there, but his office upstairs suddenly felt very far away. "I'm scared too," Annie said. Maria gave a small bitter laugh. "That was not the speech I hoped for. I don't have a speech. But I know this. He cut hours because people told the truth. That means the truth reached him." Maria was quiet. Annie continued, "Send the proof. I'll tell Helen. Don't argue with him on the floor. Don't give him a reason to make you look like the problem. You sound like a lawyer now." "No, I sound like someone who got tired of apologizing." After the call, Annie went straight to Helen. Helen read the messages without speaking. Her face settled into the look Annie had learned to recognize, calm on the outside, furious underneath. "This is retaliation," Helen said. "Can Patricia use it?" "Yes, but it still hurts them now." Helen looked up. "Then we move faster." Within the hour, Patricia Wells was in Edward's office with printed copies of the reduced schedules, the sign above the time clock, and screenshots from Maria and Tanya. Nathan Cole joined by video. His face looked tense before anyone began. Edward stood at the head of the table, hands resting on the back of a chair. Patricia spoke first. "We can document a pattern of wage withholding and likely retaliation. If we wait too long, workers lose more hours and may stop cooperating." Nathan said, "Can we terminate the subcontract immediately?" "You can suspend Reed from future hotel work," Patricia said. "But be careful. If Marcus shuts down or lays people off, he will blame the workers and us." Edward's voice was controlled. "He is already punishing them. Then pair suspension with worker support," Helen said. "Emergency assistance, temporary placements if possible, and a clear statement that any vendor under review cannot retaliate against employees for wage complaints." Nathan rubbed his forehead. "A statement from whom?" "From you," Edward said. "Your company is in the chain." Nathan looked into the camera. "And yours?" Edward did not look away. "Yes, The room went quiet at that. Annie stood near the side wall, holding a file folder against her chest. She had not been asked to sit at the table, but Edward had asked her to be present. Not as decoration, as witness. Nathan exhaled. All right, we issue a notice to the primary vendor and demand Reed preserve payroll records, schedules, communications, and timekeeping data. We suspend new assignments pending review. We offer workers a confidential channel. Patricia nodded. And we prepare for a community labor hearing if Reed refuses cooperation. Annie looked up. A hearing? Edward turned to her. A public forum through the city's labor advisory office. Not a trial. But it puts testimony and records in front of people Marcus cannot bully in his office. Her stomach tightened. Would workers have to speak? Only if they choose, Patricia said. Annie thought of Tanya's pale face, Maria's anger, Daryl's cap twisting in his hands. Public was harder than private. Public could heal, but it could also expose. What about Marcus? She asked. He will be invited to respond, Patricia said. Annie knew what that meant. Marcus would come dressed well. He would smile. He would call it misunderstanding, policy, market pressure, payroll error. He would look at people like Annie and make them sound ungrateful. Edward saw the change in her face. You don't have to decide anything today. Annie nodded, but the thought had already entered the room and taken a seat. That evening, Reed Commercial Laundry received formal notice from Cole Hospitality's legal department, copied to Whitmore Council. By the next morning, Marcus had called an all-staff meeting. He stood on a low step near the loading area, clipboard in hand, a company polo tucked into pressed khakis. Around him, workers gathered in clusters. Some folded their arms. Some kept their eyes down. The machines were off for once, and the silence made the room feel bare. I'll make this quick, Marcus said. There are rumors going around. False claims about payroll. Outside parties are trying to interfere with our business. I want to be clear. This company has followed policy. Maria stood near the back beside Tanya. Daryl leaned against a cart, jaw tight. Marcus continued. If certain former employees are unhappy with their choices, that is not our concern. But spreading lies has consequences. Reduced demand means reduced hours. That is business. Someone muttered, demand ain't reduced. Marcus's eyes moved across the room. Excuse me? No one answered. He smiled thinly. That's what I thought. Then Carla from payroll stepped forward. She had been quiet for years, quiet enough that people often forgot she heard everything. She held a folder in both hands. Marcus, she said. His face hardened. Not now. Yes, now. The workers shifted. Carla's voice shook, but she kept going. Payroll wasn't delayed because of the bank. Not all those times. Marcus stared at her. You need to go back to your desk. I processed what you told me to process. Carla, you told me to hold checks when cash flow was fine. You told me to code deductions as uniform recovery. You told me overtime had to be adjusted because the hotels wouldn't pay. But they had already paid. No one moved. Marcus stepped down from the platform. You don't know what you're talking about. Carla lifted the folder. I made copies. The words landed like a dropped plate. Maria's hand went to her mouth. Daryl stood upright. Tanya began crying silently. Not from sadness, but from the shock of hearing someone inside the office say what everyone on the floor had known in their bodies. Marcus walked toward Carla. Give me that. She stepped back. No, give me the folder. A loading supervisor moved as if to intervene, but Daryl pushed away from the cart. Don't touch her, he said. Marcus turned on him. You want to be next? Daryl's voice was low. I've been next for 3 years. That was the moment Reed Commercial Laundry changed. Not fixed, not safe, but changed. The fear did not disappear, but it moved. It was no longer only in the workers. Some of it had crossed the room and reached Marcus. By noon, Carla had called Patricia Wells. By 2, she was sitting in a conference room at Whitmore Foundation with the folder on the table, hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee. Annie sat across from her, stunned by the woman's tired face. Carla looked at Annie. I should have said something sooner. Annie did not know how to answer. Part of her wanted to say, yes, You should have. Another part saw the fear in Carla's eyes and recognized it. Instead, Annie said, "You're saying it now." Carla nodded, and tears gathered in the creases beside her eyes. "I have 2 grandsons. I kept telling myself I couldn't lose my job. Then I saw you come in for that check. You looked so scared, but you still asked. I kept thinking, if she can stand there with nothing, what am I doing hiding behind a desk?" Annie looked down at her hands. Patricia opened the folder. Inside were emails, handwritten notes, deduction codes, payroll adjustment sheets, and copies of checks held past issue dates. Enough paper to turn whispers into evidence. Edward entered near the end of Carla's statement. He did not interrupt. He stood by the door and listened. When Carla finished, the room stayed quiet. Patricia finally said, "This changes things." Edward looked at the folder. "How much?" "Enough to justify a public hearing. Enough to demand records. Possibly enough for state labor involvement." Carla wiped her cheek. "Will I lose my job?" Edward answered before Patricia could. "You may. Marcus may try. If he does, we will help you." Carla gave a tired laugh. "Help doesn't pay rent forever." "No," Edward said, "but silence has been charging you rent too." Carla looked at him, then at Annie. "That girl knew that before the rest of us did." Annie shook her head. "I didn't know anything. I was just hungry." Edward's voice was quiet. Sometimes hunger tells the truth before comfort is ready to hear it. That night, Annie brought Clara the news. Clara listened with both hands around a mug of tea while Annie described the staff meeting. Carla's folder. Daryl stepping forward. When Annie finished, Clara nodded slowly. "A crooked house does not fall because one board complains," she said. "It falls when enough boards stop pretending the floor is level." Annie leaned back in the chair, exhausted. "There's going to be a hearing. Will you speak?" "I don't know." Clara did not press. After a while, Annie said, "Marcus will make me sound like a liar. He will try. He'll say I wanted attention. People who steal bread always accuse the hungry of being dramatic." Annie looked toward the window. Outside, Atlanta moved through another cold evening. Somewhere, restaurant lights were coming on. Somewhere, laundry machines were turning. Somewhere, a worker was checking a phone, hoping for a deposit that might not arrive. "I don't want to be the story," Annie said. Clara reached across the table and covered her hand. "Then don't be the story," she said. "Be the witness." Annie sat with that for a long time. By morning, Patricia had filed the request for a community labor hearing. Marcus Reed would have to answer questions outside his own office, away from the machines, away from the time clock, away from the fear he had used like a locked door. And Annie, whether she was ready or not, knew the door was opening. The hearing notice reached Marcus Reed before noon. By 1 o'clock, he had called his lawyer. By 3, he had called the primary vendor and blamed Whitmore for trying to ruin a small business. By 5, someone had posted a short video online. Annie did not see it until Maria called her that evening. "Don't open anything yet," Maria said. Annie stood in Clara's kitchen with a dish towel in her hand. "What happened? You need to hear it from me before somebody sends it." Clara looked up from the table. Annie's stomach tightened. "Maria, it's a video from that night. The alley. You by the trash bin." The towel slipped slightly in Annie's hand. "Who posted it?" "I don't know. Some local account. Caption says, Whitmore's new charity case caught digging through restaurant garbage before accusing employer." For a second, Annie could not hear the kitchen around her. The refrigerator hum disappeared. Clara's chair creaked, but the sound came from far away. Maria continued, softer now. "They're calling you names in the comments. Not everybody. Some people are defending you, but enough." Annie set the towel on the counter very carefully. "Send it." "Annie, send it." A moment later, her phone buzzed. Clara rose slowly. "Child." Annie opened the link. The video was short, maybe 20 seconds, shot from across the street or from a restaurant doorway. The angle made her look smaller, bent over the trash bin with the plastic bag on her wrist. Her hands moved through discarded containers. She lifted the bread, wiped it, tucked it away. The clip ended before Edward crossed the street, before the conversation, before the card, before anyone could know she had been owed wages. The caption did the rest. Comments stacked below it. "So this is who they're letting speak at hearings now? Bet she got paid more from Whitmore than she ever earned. Always somebody else's fault." Trash girl. Annie's thumb stopped there. Trash girl. She closed the phone, but the words stayed open inside her. Clara reached for her arm. Let me see. No. Annie. No, ma'am. Her voice came out thin. Please. Clara did not push. She guided Annie to the chair and sat beside her. For a while, Annie looked at the table without speaking. There was a small scratch in the wood near her hand, shaped like a crooked line. She fixed her eyes on it because if she looked anywhere else, she might fall apart. I knew people saw me, she said at last. I just didn't know they kept it. Clara's face tightened with pain. Some people will record a wound before they think to bandage it. Annie's mouth trembled. I was so hungry. I know. I wasn't trying to be dirty. I wasn't trying to be shameful. I checked the food. I was careful. You do not have to explain hunger at this table, but Annie could not stop. I brushed the bread off because I didn't want to get sick. I put it in the bag because I was going to share it. And now they're laughing like I'm something nasty. Clara placed a hand over hers. You are not nasty. Annie wiped her face quickly, angry at the tears. I don't want to go tomorrow. To work? To anywhere. Clara did not answer right away. She looked older in the kitchen light, older and tired, but steady in a way Annie needed. Then tonight you don't go anywhere, Clara said. Tonight you sit here, you breathe, you drink tea you don't want. Tomorrow can wait its turn. But tomorrow did not wait. By morning, the video had been shared by 3 local pages. One added Marcus's claim that a former employee was working with outsiders to damage his business after leaving under questionable circumstances. Another posted a cropped photograph of Edward's car from that night and asked whether the whole story was a staged publicity move. Rachel called Annie before 7. Mr. Whitmore wants you to know we are handling this, she said. Annie sat on the edge of her bed, still dressed in the sweatshirt she had slept in. Handling how? We're not responding without your consent. Patricia says the video may help establish your condition that night, but no one will use it unless you agree. My condition, Annie repeated. Rachel went quiet. I'm sorry. That sounded cold. It's fine. It isn't. Annie pressed her fingers against her eyes. Does Mr. Whitmore think I should stay home? He said you should do what you need. Helen said she'll come get you if you want to come in and don't want the bus. Annie almost said no out of habit. Then she remembered Clara. Don't make yourself smaller, to fit inside anybody's office. I want to come in, Annie said, though her voice shook. But I don't want to walk through the lobby alone. You won't. Helen picked her up 40 minutes later. She did not mention the video until Annie did. Did you watch it? Annie asked. Yes. Annie turned toward the window. Helen kept both hands on the wheel. I watched it once. That was enough. Everybody else keeps watching it. Everybody else does not deserve a vote on your dignity. Annie gave a bitter little laugh. They're voting anyway. Helen drove a few blocks before speaking again. When I was 30, I lost my house after my husband died. Bank error, bad advice, pride, all tangled together. A neighbor saw my furniture on the curb and told half the church before Sunday. For years, I thought of myself as the woman with the sofa in the yard. Then one day I realized shame is a thief. It steals the event and makes it your name. Annie looked at her. Helen glanced over. Do not let them rename you. At Whitmore, Rachel waited outside the building, not in the lobby. She walked in beside Annie as if they were arriving together for any ordinary workday. The security guard greeted Annie by name. That almost broke her more than insult would have. Downstairs, the foundation office had changed, not in its work. Boxes still needed packing, phones still rang, but people looked up with careful kindness, and Annie hated that kindness for a moment because it told her they knew. Maria was there, sitting with Patricia near the conference room. She stood when Annie entered. I should have warned you faster, Maria said. You did. I wanted to punch my phone. Annie gave a weak bray. That might not help the case. No, but it would help me. Daryl came later. Tanya too. Carla arrived with more documents and eyes red from lack of sleep. The video that was meant to isolate Annie had done something Marcus had not intended. It made the others angry enough to stop whispering. Patricia gathered them in the conference room. I need to say this plainly, she began. The video is cruel, but it may also prove that Annie was in visible distress shortly after wages were withheld. Marcus may try to use it to shame her. We can use the truth to answer him, but only if Annie agrees. All eyes turned toward Annie. Her throat closed. Edward sat at the far end of the room, silent. He did not rescue her from the moment. At first she hated that too. Then she understood. If he spoke for her now, Marcus would say he had built the whole story for her. Annie looked down at her hands. They were clean that morning, nails trimmed, a small cut near one knuckle from a cardboard box at work. She remembered those same hands in the trash bin, brushing mud from bread. "I don't want that video shown," she said. Patricia nodded. "Then it will not be shown by us. But I want people to know what it doesn't show." The room stayed quiet. Annie lifted her head. "It doesn't show that I had worked. It doesn't show the paycheck that didn't come. It doesn't show me refusing Mr. Whitmore's money because I thought Mrs. Clara needed medicine more than I needed dinner. It doesn't show Marcus shorting my check. It just shows the part people can laugh at." Maria's eyes filled. Annie swallowed. "If he brings it up at the hearing, I'll answer it. But I don't want to hide from it anymore." Edward's face changed, not with pride exactly, but with respect sharpened by sorrow. Patricia wrote one line on her pad. "Then we prepare you to answer, not defend." There is a difference. Annie nodded, though she did not fully understand yet. At lunch, Edward found her in the small break room with a cup of tea she had not touched. He stood at the doorway first. "May I come in?" She nodded. He sat across from her. "I am sorry." "For what?" "For being part of a world where someone thought recording you was easier than helping you." Annie looked into the tea. "You helped. Not soon enough. You didn't know me." "No," he said. "But I knew hunger existed. I knew late wages existed. I knew subcontractors hid ugly things behind clean invoices. Knowing in general is not the same as looking directly. I had done too much of the first and not enough of the second." Annie did not know what to say to that. Edward placed something on the table. It was the original business card he had given her. Or rather, a copy of the same card. Clean and new. "I thought you might want another one," he said, "in case the first got damaged." Annie touched the pocket of her jacket, where the old card still sat inside her small notebook. "I still have it." "Good." She looked up. "I'm scared of the hearing. I would be worried if you weren't. What if my voice shakes? Then it shakes. What if Marcus laughs? Then let him show the room who he is." Annie let out a slow breath. Edward stood to leave, then paused. "Miss Brooks, the video shows a hard moment. It does not show a small person." After he left, Annie finally drank the tea. It had gone lukewarm, but she finished it anyway. That evening, when she got home, Clara was waiting at the table with the notebook open. "What's that?" Annie asked. "Your statement." "My what?" "If they try to make that video your whole story, we will make sure you remember the rest." Annie sat across from her. Clara handed her a pen. So Annie began to write. Not a speech. Not yet. Just pieces of truth. "I worked those hours. My paycheck was late. I was hungry. I was ashamed. I refused the money. I took the card. I came back the next day." The sentences were plain, but each one put a piece of herself back where the video had tried to tear it away. By midnight, she had filled 2 pages. At the bottom, Clara told her to write one more line. Annie hesitated, then wrote it slowly. "I was not trash. I was unpaid." The morning of the hearing arrived colder than Annie expected. She stood in Clara's kitchen before sunrise, wearing the pale yellow blouse she had worn to Whitmore on her first day. Clara had pressed it the night before with careful hands, laying a towel over the fabric and smoothing each sleeve as if preparing Annie for church. The blouse still showed its age, but it was clean. Annie's hair was pulled back. The old business card sat inside her notebook, tucked behind the 2 pages she had written with Clara. "I was not trash. I was unpaid." She read the line once before closing the notebook. Clara watched from the table with a cup of tea between both hands. "You don't have to sound perfect. I know. You don't have to make them cry. I know. You don't have to make Marcus understand." Annie looked up. Clara's eyes were steady. "Some people protect their wrongs so long they start calling them truth. Don't waste your breath trying to fix his soul. Just tell what happened." Annie nodded, but her fingers were cold. Helen arrived at 7:30. She came upstairs instead of honking from the street, because Clara had told her once that decent people came to the door when picking someone up for something hard. "You ready?" Helen asked. No, Annie said. Helen gave a small nod. Good. That means you know what this is. Clara stood slowly and took Annie's face between her hands. Remember who you are before they try to tell you. Annie's eyes stung. Annie Brooks. That's right. The drive to Atlanta City Hall was quiet for the first 10 minutes. Helen kept the radio off. Outside, the city was waking under a gray sky. Delivery trucks backed into alleys. Restaurant workers carried boxes through side doors. Men in suits crossed intersections with coffee in hand. Annie watched them and thought of the first night, the trash bin, the bread, the thin plastic bag. It felt far away, and still close enough to touch. When City Hall came into view, Annie's stomach tightened. People were already gathered near the entrance. Some were workers from Reed Commercial Laundry. Some were reporters. A few held phones. Annie saw Maria first, standing with Daryl and Tanya near the steps. Carla was there too, holding her folder against her coat like a shield. Edward stood a little apart from them, speaking with Patricia Wells. Nathan Cole was beside him, looking less certain than he had in the conference room. When Edward saw Annie, he did not rush toward her. He simply nodded, giving her space to arrive on her own feet. Maria came over. You good? No. Me neither. Daryl rubbed his hands together. At least we match. Tanya gave a nervous laugh that broke some of the tension. Annie was grateful for it. Inside, the hearing room was plain. Rows of chairs, a long table at the front, microphones, a city seal on the wall, an American flag in the corner. It looked less dramatic than Annie had imagined, and somehow that made it worse. Ordinary rooms could hold painful things without changing shape. Patricia guided them to seats near the front. Remember, she said quietly, answer what is asked. Do not argue with Marcus. Do not chase insults. Truth does not need to run. Annie opened her notebook and touched the edge of the card. At 9 o'clock, the hearing officer, a woman named Denise Harper, called the room to order. Her voice was firm, practiced, and tired in the way public servants often sounded after years of hearing people explain why someone else's pain was not their fault. This is a community labor hearing regarding wage complaints connected to Reed Commercial Laundry Services and associated contracting partners, she said. This is not a criminal trial. It is a public fact-finding session. We will maintain order. Marcus Reed sat at the table on the other side with his attorney. He wore a dark suit Annie had never seen before. His hair was trimmed. His face carried a look of wounded patience, as if he had been dragged there by unreasonable people. When his eyes moved across the room and found Annie, he gave no sign of recognition. That hurt more than a glare. Patricia began with records. She did not start with Annie. She started with dates, payments, hours, deduction codes, and copies Carla had provided. The room was quiet as she laid out the pattern. Hotel invoices paid on time, workers paid late, overtime reduced, deductions listed under vague labels, schedule cuts after complaints. Marcus's attorney responded smoothly. Small businesses sometimes face cash flow challenges. Mr. Reed has served major hospitality clients for years. Any payroll irregularities were administrative, not malicious. Denise Harper looked over her glasses. We will let the testimony speak to that. Maria spoke first. Her voice shook at the beginning, then strengthened when she described photographing the time clock because her hours kept disappearing. Daryl followed. He explained the reduced hours after his shoulder complaint and the missing overtime from weekend loading. Tanya cried before she reached the microphone. But when she spoke, the room listened. She read Marcus's text aloud. If you want stable hours, stop creating outside problems. Marcus shifted in his chair. Carla came next. She opened her folder with hands that trembled but did not stop. I processed payroll under Mr. Reed's instructions, she said. I was told to hold checks after funds were available. I was told to use deduction codes that did not match what workers had actually done. I should have reported it sooner. Marcus leaned toward his attorney and whispered sharply. Denise Harper looked at him. Mr. Reed, you will have a chance to respond. Carla kept going. I am saying this because workers came asking for money they had earned, and I watched them leave with excuses. That was wrong. Then Patricia called Annie. For a moment, Annie could not stand. Her legs seemed to belong to another person. Helen leaned close. Feet first, she whispered. Annie stood. The walk to the microphone took only a few seconds, but it carried every night she had spent making hunger smaller so she could survive it. She placed her notebook on the table but did not open it yet. State your name for the record, Denise Harper said gently. Annie swallowed. Clara's voice rose in her mind. Give it clean. My name is Annie Brooks. Miss Brooks, where did you work before joining Whitmore Foundation? Reed Commercial Laundry Services. How long? About 6 months. Patricia stood nearby. Were your wages delayed? Yes. How long before the incident that has been discussed in public? Annie knew what that meant. The video, the alley, the comments. Trash girl. Almost 2 weeks. Patricia's voice stayed calm. Can you tell the room what happened that evening? Annie's hands tightened on the edge of the table. She could feel Marcus watching now. I had worked. I had not been paid. I didn't have enough money for a meal. I went behind a restaurant because sometimes food gets thrown away still wrapped. The room was silent. I found some bread, a little food in a box. I cleaned off what I could. I was going to eat some and take some home. Marcus's attorney stood. Miss Brooks, were you authorized to remove items from that property? A murmur moved through the room. Denise Harper looked at him. Counsel. Tread carefully. Annie felt heat rise in her face, but Patricia did not object. She only looked at Annie. Steady. Annie answered. No one authorized me to be hungry either. The room went still. Edward lowered his eyes. Maria whispered, Amen, before catching herself. Marcus's attorney sat down. Patricia asked, Did Mr. Whitmore offer you money that night? Yes. Did you accept it? No. Why not? Annie opened her notebook, but she did not read yet, because I knew people who needed help too. Mrs. Clara needed medicine. Others in my building were short. I was hungry, but I had a job. I thought I would be paid soon. Were you paid? Not fully. When I went back, my check was short. Patricia nodded. Miss Brooks, a video of you in that alley was posted online. Do you want to address it? Annie looked at Denise Harper, then at the workers, then finally at Marcus. Yes. Her voice shook, but it did not break. That video shows me taking food from a trash bin. It does not show the hours I worked. It does not show the paycheck that didn't come. It does not show me standing in Mr. Reed's office asking for what I earned. It does not show the other people who were shorted too. She looked down at her notebook and read the last line. I was not trash. I was unpaid. No one spoke for several seconds. Then Denise Harper said, softly but clearly, let the record reflect that statement. Marcus's face had changed. The injured patience was gone. What remained was anger trying to dress itself as control. His attorney placed a hand on his sleeve, but Marcus pulled away and stood. This is ridiculous, he said. I run a business, not a charity. People miss shifts, damage uniforms, create problems, then come here crying because some billionaire gave them attention. Denise Harper struck the table once with her palm. Mr. Reed, sit down. But he had already shown the room enough. Edward stood next. He did not raise his voice. My name is Edward Whitmore, he said when called, and I want to be clear. I did not create Miss Brooks's story. I found her at the point where the story should have shamed every adult connected to it. Marcus gave a bitter laugh. Edward turned toward him. You paid late. You paid short. Then when she spoke, you tried to make hunger look like a character flaw. Denise Harper warned, Mr. Whitmore. Edward nodded. I'll keep to the facts. Whitmore Council and Cole Hospitality have records showing vendor payments were made before worker wages were delayed. We are prepared to fund an independent payroll audit and support restitution for affected workers. Nathan Cole stood after him. Cole Hospitality will cooperate fully. We will suspend Reed Commercial Laundry from new assignments, pending review, and require wage compliance from all subcontractors moving forward. Marcus's attorney whispered urgently, but Marcus no longer looked calm. He looked cornered. Denise Harper looked across the table. Mr. Reed, you will provide payroll records, schedules, deduction policies, and communications requested by counsel within the stated period. This hearing will reconvene if necessary. Based on today's testimony, I will also recommend referral to the appropriate labor authorities. A sound moved through the room, not applause, something quieter, A release of breath held too long. Annie stepped away from the microphone. Her knees shook so badly she had to grip the back of her chair before sitting. Maria reached over and took her hand under the table. "You did it," Maria whispered. Annie shook her head. "We did." At the front of the room, Marcus gathered his papers with sharp, angry movements. As he passed near Annie's row, he leaned just close enough for her to hear. "You'll regret this." Before Annie could answer, Clara's cane tapped the floor behind her. Clara had come after all, standing near the aisle in her Sunday coat, eyes fixed on Marcus. "No," Clara said. She already regretted staying quiet. "This is something else." Marcus looked at the older woman, then away. For the first time since Annie had known him, he walked out of a room without owning it. Outside City Hall, the cold air hit Annie's face. And only then did she realize how warm the hearing room had been. People gathered on the steps in small groups, speaking in low voices, holding folders against their coats, checking phones, wiping eyes without wanting anyone to notice. The reporters stayed near the bottom of the stairs, waiting for someone important enough to quote. Edward and Nathan were pulled aside almost at once, but Edward looked back toward Annie before answering a question. He did not wave her over. He let her choose where to stand. Annie chose Clara. The older woman stood near a stone column, both hands resting on her cane, her Sunday coat buttoned to the throat. Annie walked to her and, for a moment, forgot who might be watching. She folded into Clara's arms. "You came," Annie whispered. "Of course I came. You didn't tell me. If I had told you, you would have spent the morning worrying about me instead of speaking your truth." Annie laughed once against her shoulder, and it broke into a sob she did not mean to release. Clara held her tighter. "You said it clean," Clara murmured. "No decoration, no begging, just clean." Maria joined them, then Tanya, then Daryl and Carla. No one seemed to know what to say first. They had all spent so long measuring words around Marcus that freedom felt awkward. Daryl rubbed the back of his neck. "Did that really happen?" Maria sniffed. "Which part? Annie making that lawyer sit down? Or Carla dropping a whole office worth of proof on the table?" Carla gave a tired smile. "I thought I was going to faint." "You didn't," Tanya said. "You look stronger than me." "I was not stronger than anybody. I was just too old to keep swallowing what I knew." Annie looked at Carla. Something between them had changed since the day Annie came for the short check. There was still pain there, but it no longer stood alone. "Thank you," Annie said. Carla shook her head. "Don't thank me for being late. Late is better than never." Clara lifted one eyebrow. "That depends on what kind of late we are discussing." Even Daryl smiled at that. A woman from one of the local news stations approached with a microphone and a careful expression. "Miss Brooks, would you be willing to say a few words about today?" Annie's body tightened at once. Edward stepped away from his own interview, but Clara touched Annie's wrist before he could speak. "You can say no," Clara said quietly. Annie looked at the reporter, then at the phone camera behind her. The memory of the video rose too fast. The trash bin, the comments, the name strangers had given her. For a second, she wanted to turn away. Then she remembered her own line in the notebook. "I was not trash. I was unpaid." "I'll say one thing," Annie said. The reporter nodded. "Whenever you're ready." Annie did not look into the camera. She looked at the steps, at the workers behind her, at the city beyond them. "A lot of people think hunger means someone didn't try hard enough," she said. "But some of us were trying every day. We were working. We were showing up. We were waiting on money we had already earned. That matters. That should matter before somebody has to be humiliated for anyone to listen." The reporter's face changed. "Thank you. That's all," Annie said. And this time, when she stepped back, no one pushed for more. Edward came over after the camera moved away. Nathan stood beside him, looking at the workers with an expression that had lost some of its business polish. "Miss Brooks," Edward said, "you did something difficult today." Annie was too tired to be gracious. "I almost threw up," Maria said. "She still did better than Marcus." Edward's mouth moved with the smallest smile. "That is a low but accurate bar." Nathan cleared his throat. "I owe all of you more than an apology. My company benefited from work we did not examine closely enough. We will fund the wage audit and cooperate with restitution. I know that does not undo what happened." Daryl looked at him. "When?" Nathan blinked. "When what? When do people get paid?" The question cut through the air without rudeness. Nathan looked at Edward, then back at Daryl. We begin the audit immediately. Emergency assistance can start sooner for anyone whose hours were cut. Daryl nodded, not satisfied, but listening. Put that in writing. Nathan looked almost surprised, then gave a short nod. Fair. Patricia Wells arrived with her briefcase and a stack of notes. Good. Everyone is learning. She turned to the workers. I'll need each of you to review your statements this week. Do not post details online. Do not argue with strangers in comment sections. Do not confront Marcus alone. If he contacts you, document it. Maria folded her arms. He already told Annie she'd regret it. Patricia's eyes moved to Annie. When? After the hearing. Exact words? You'll regret this. Patricia wrote it down. Thank you. Annie almost laughed from exhaustion. That's evidence too? Threats often are. Clara tapped her cane. Then he's generous with evidence. This time, several people laughed, and the sound eased something in Annie's chest. But the relief did not last long. By the next morning, the story had spread. The short clip of Annie's statement outside City Hall was shared alongside the old alley video. Some people apologized in the comments. Some did not. The ugliest voices grew louder because truth had cornered them, and cornered cruelty often makes noise. At Reed Commercial Laundry, Marcus did not come in until noon. A supervisor told workers he was handling legal matters. The time clock sign had been removed, but everyone had seen it. Maria took another picture of the blank wall where it had been. At Whitmore Foundation, Annie tried to work through the noise. She answered intake calls, corrected addresses, and helped Helen prepare emergency assistance forms for Reed workers whose hours had been cut. 3 people applied before lunch. 2 were ashamed to ask. 1 apologized 4 times. Annie told each one, "You worked. You deserve to eat." By mid-afternoon, Edward called Annie, Helen, Patricia, and Rachel into a conference room. Nathan joined by video again. This time he did not look cautious. He looked committed, though Annie had learned commitment in rich men needed paperwork before she trusted it. Edward placed a document on the table. Temporary Worker Relief Plan, effective today. Funded jointly by Whitmore and Cole Hospitality until the audit is complete. Helen picked it up first. Food support, transit cards, utility referrals, emergency rent screening, legal intake. Rachel added, and temporary placement interviews for any Reed worker whose hours are reduced in retaliation. We can't place everyone at Whitmore, but we can connect with partner employers. Annie read the page slowly. Will workers have to go public? No, Patricia said. Not for relief. Good. Edward watched her. What else? Annie looked up. Make the form simple. People won't fill out 6 pages when they're scared. Helen nodded. Agreed. And don't ask for proof they're poor before you help them eat. Rachel wrote that down. Nathan said through the screen. We need some verification. Annie looked at him. For payroll claims, yes. For dinner, no. The room went quiet. Edward turned to Nathan. She's right. Nathan exhaled. All right. We separate emergency food from wage documentation. Helen's pencil moved across the page. Done. That evening, Annie carried a stack of food vouchers to the front desk of the foundation office. The same security guard who had greeted her by name on the morning after the video helped direct workers upstairs. One by one, people from Reed arrived. Some Annie knew, some she had only passed near the machines. They came stiff with embarrassment, suspicious of kindness, angry at needing it. Annie recognized every expression. A man named Luis stood in front of her, twisting a work cap in his hands. I'm not used to this. Me neither, Annie said. He looked at her, surprised. She handed him a voucher and a transit card. This doesn't mean you failed. It means somebody delayed what you earned. And you still have to live while they get caught up. Luis took the cards slowly. You believe that? I'm trying to. He nodded once. Then I'll try too. Near closing, Edward came downstairs and saw the line of workers moving through the office. No cameras, no speeches, just names checked, vouchers handed out, phone numbers written down, people treated like their need did not make them less adult. Annie was at the table, explaining the form to Tanya. You don't have to fill in this part tonight, Annie said. Bring the pay stub when you can. For food assistance, this is enough. Tanya wiped her face. I hate needing this. I know. No, I really hate it. Annie paused, then said, "The first night Mr. Whitmore offered me money, I couldn't take it. I thought accepting help would make the alley true." Tanya looked at her. "Did it?" "No. Marcus made the alley happen. Help got me out of it." Tanya lowered her eyes, then signed the form. After everyone left, Annie stayed to stack chairs. Helen told her to go home twice. Annie ignored her twice. Finally, Edward picked up 2 chairs himself and carried them to the wall. "You do know we pay people to clean conference rooms," Helen said. Edward set the chairs down. "I'm expanding my skill set." Annie smiled despite the heaviness in her bones. When the room was back in order, she found the old business card in her notebook and looked at it again. The edges had softened. The ink on the back had faded slightly from being touched too many times. Helen noticed. "Still carrying it?" "Yes." "Why?" Annie thought about the alley, the hearing, the workers who had come through the office ashamed and left with food for the night. "Because I used to think it was only a door for me," she said. Edward, standing nearby, heard her but did not interrupt. Annie closed the notebook. "Now I think it was a handle. Somebody still had to pull it open." 2 weeks after the hearing, Marcus Reed learned what it felt like to have paperwork turn against him. For years, paper had served him. Payroll codes, deduction lines, schedule changes, policy notices taped above time clocks. He had hidden behind office words because most workers were too tired to fight language that looked official. Now those same words sat in folders on Patricia Wells's desk, copied, dated, numbered, and matched against bank records. The first result came on a Wednesday morning. Helen found Annie in the supply room counting hygiene kits and called her to the conference room. Maria, Daryl, Tanya, Carla, Edward, Patricia, and Nathan were already there. No one looked relaxed, but the air felt different from before. Less like fear, more like waiting. Patricia stood at the head of the table with a document in front of her. "The independent payroll review is not complete," she said, "but the preliminary findings are strong enough for immediate corrective action. Reed Commercial Laundry has agreed, through counsel, to issue back pay for documented unpaid wages and improper deductions identified so far." Maria covered her mouth. "How much?" "It varies by worker. Some amounts are small, some are not." Patricia looked at Daryl. "Your overtime and schedule reduction claim is included in the first group." Daryl stared at her. "You mean they're paying it?" "Yes." "When?" "Initial payments begin Friday." Tanya began crying before anyone else moved. Maria put an arm around her. Daryl sat back and looked at the ceiling, blinking hard. Carla lowered her head, both hands gripping the edge of the table. Annie did not cry right away. She watched Patricia's mouth continue moving, but the words reached her slowly. Initial payments, documented unpaid wages, improper deductions. Friday. Friday. A day that had once meant waiting for money that did not come. Now it meant someone had been forced to return what was taken. Edward watched the workers, not the document. "And Marcus?" Patricia turned a page. "Marcus Reed has been removed from day-to-day management pending the labor investigation. Cole Hospitality and its primary vendor have suspended all new work with Reed Commercial Laundry until compliance conditions are met. The state labor office has opened an inquiry." "Removed?" Maria said. "Administrative leave, according to his attorney," Patricia replied. "But he no longer controls schedules or payroll." For a second, no one spoke. Then Daryl let out a sound halfway between a laugh and a breath. "So he can't cut my hours tomorrow because he woke up mad?" "No," Patricia said, "not without several people watching." Clara was not in the room, but Annie could hear what she would have said. A watched snake is still a snake, but it bites less freely. Nathan Cole cleared his throat. "There is something else. Cole Hospitality is creating a vendor compliance requirement across all service contractors, payroll audits, worker complaint channels, and proof of wage payment before contract renewal. Whitmore is doing the same for its related vendor chains." Annie looked at Edward. He answered before she asked. "We should have done it earlier." Nathan nodded. "Yes, we should have." There was no grand speech after that. No one clapped. People who have been underpaid do not always know how to celebrate. Being returned a portion of what should never have been taken. They sat with the news like people warming their hands near a fire they were not sure would last. Maria finally said, "I'm buying tires." Daryl looked over. For the car? For the car that got towed because I couldn't fix it when he shorted me. She wiped her face. I'm getting it back. Tanya gave a small laugh through tears. I'm paying the power bill before they send another notice. Daryl nodded. I might buy meat that isn't marked down twice. That made the room laugh, not because it was funny, but because everyone understood the size of such a wish. Annie sat quietly until Edward turned to her. Miss Brooks? She looked up. Your remaining wages are in the first group too. Her throat tightened. All of it? All documented hours and improper deductions. She looked down at the table. The amount would not make her rich. It would not erase the alley, the video, or the nights she had told herself water was enough, but it would say, in the only language Marcus had respected, that her time had value. Thank you, she said. Patricia corrected gently. You earned it. Annie nodded. I know. I'm practicing saying that. That Friday, the checks arrived, not in Marcus's office, not slid across a desk with contempt. The payments came through a temporary processing arrangement overseen by the primary vendor and reviewed by Patricia's team. Workers could pick up checks at the foundation or receive direct deposit if they had accounts. Many came in person because they wanted to see it with their own eyes. The foundation office became something between a payroll station, a community hall, and a place where people remembered how to stand a little taller. Helen set coffee on a side table. Rachel organized envelopes. Patricia answered questions. Edward stayed mostly in the background, speaking only when spoken to. Nathan came too, and this time he did not wear a suit jacket. Annie noticed. Maybe he had learned that some rooms did not need polish. They needed sleeves ready to work. Maria arrived first and opened her envelope at the table. She stared at the check, then pressed it against her chest. Don't nobody talk to me for a minute, she said. No one did. Daryl turned his check over twice. They spelled my name right. Carla, standing near the door, smiled sadly. I made sure. Tanya sat in a chair and cried so hard Helen brought tissues without a word. When Annie's turn came, Rachel handed her the envelope with both hands. Here you go. Annie took it and stepped aside. She opened it slowly. The check was larger than she expected. Not because it was generous, but because theft becomes shocking when added correctly. She saw the overtime, the missing regular hours, the deduction reversal, her name printed clearly, Annie Brooks. She thought of the first time Rachel had handed her a visitor badge. She thought of Clara smoothing the schedule on the kitchen table. She thought of the trash bin and the bread she had tried to make clean with cold fingers. Edward came to stand near her but said nothing. Annie looked at the check. This would have changed that night. Yes, Edward said. If he had paid me when he was supposed to, I wouldn't have been in that alley. No. She folded the check carefully. That's the part people don't understand. They see the alley and think that was the story. But the story started before I got there. Edward nodded. And now people know that. Some people. That is where change starts. Annie gave him a tired look. You always talk like a man who has buildings named after him. He accepted the correction with a small smile. Fair. She looked back at the room. Workers were comparing papers, asking Patricia questions, hugging without planning to. Luis, the man who had once twisted his cap while asking for help, stood near the coffee with a check in one hand and a transit card in the other. Change starts when rent gets paid, Annie said. Edward followed her gaze. Then we should make sure it does. By the next week, the temporary relief plan had become more structured. Emergency food help remained simple. Wage claims went through Patricia's team. Transit cards were offered without lectures. A local credit union agreed to help workers open basic accounts. A community college workforce counselor offered evening information sessions in the foundation office. Helen put Annie in charge of organizing the first session. I'm not qualified for that, Annie said. Helen handed her a sign-up sheet. You know how to make people feel less foolish for asking questions. That qualifies you more than most. So Annie called workers and explained the session in plain language. No, you don't have to enroll in anything. Yes, you can just listen. No, nobody will ask about your grades. Yes, it's after shifts. Yes, there will be food. That last part mattered most. Annie knew it would. The night of the session, folding chairs filled the room. Not all from Reed. Word had traveled to hotel housekeepers, kitchen workers, janitors, drivers, laundry sorters from other companies. People came tired, suspicious, curious. Some wore uniforms, some came straight from buses. Clara came too, because she said a retired teacher had a professional obligation to sit in the back and judge whether the presenter spoke clearly. The counselor talked about certificate programs, logistics training, bookkeeping, healthcare support roles, tuition assistance. Annie watched faces change when people realized the room was not selling a dream, it was offering steps. During the break, a woman in a hotel uniform approached Annie. "You the one from the video?" Annie felt the old tightening. "Yes," the woman nodded. "I saw the second clip too, from the hearing." She paused. "My check's been short twice. Not from Reed, different company." Annie reached for a blank intake card. "Write down what happened. Dates if you have them. Hours if you remember." The woman took the card. "I don't want trouble." "I know. What if they fire me?" Annie did not lie. "They might try, but if nobody writes anything down, they get to pretend it never happened." The woman looked at the card, then tucked it into her purse. Across the room, Edward saw the exchange. Later, after the chairs were stacked and the coffee thrown out, he found Annie by the supply shelves. "Do you see what is happening?" he asked. She sealed a box of leftover handouts. "People are tired." "Yes, and they are coming anyway." Annie leaned against the table. "That doesn't mean they trust us." "No, but maybe they trust you." She looked down. Trust still felt too large, like a coat she had not grown into. Edward said, "I want to formalize this, not only as emergency relief after damage is done. A program for workers dealing with delayed wages, food gaps, transportation, legal referrals, simple access, no humiliation built into the process." Annie looked at him. "That sounds expensive." "It will be. People will say you're rewarding bad choices. People say many things from full tables." She studied him. "What would you call it?" Edward shook his head. "I don't know yet." Annie looked at the food boxes stacked for the next day, each one marked with a name, an address, a need someone had finally written down. She thought of late checks, cut hours, medicine, bus fare, bread pulled from trash because earned money had been held back. "No worker goes hungry," she said. Edward repeated it slowly. "No worker goes hungry. It's plain. Plain is good. It says the problem before anyone tries to decorate it." Edward nodded. "Then that is the name." The official announcement came a month later, not at a hotel ballroom or a donor luncheon, but in the foundation's community room. Helen insisted. Clara approved. Patricia said it was more legally practical anyway. Nathan's company signed on as the first corporate partner under the new wage compliance rules. The credit union, food bank, and legal clinic joined. Whitmore funded the first year. Annie stood near the wall while Edward spoke briefly. "This program began because a worker was hungry after her wages were delayed," he said. "That should shame every system connected to it, including mine. We cannot undo every wrong today, but we can stop pretending late pay is a small inconvenience. For some people, late pay is an empty plate." He did not name Annie without permission. She had given him permission only to say worker. Afterward, he asked if she wanted to speak. Annie had planned to say no. Then she saw Maria in the second row, Daryl beside her, Tanya holding a cup of coffee with both hands, Carla near the back, Clara watching with that firm teacher's face that said, "Speak if it is true." Annie stepped forward. "I used to think help meant someone had to look down at me," she said. "I was wrong. Real help looks you in the eye and asks what was taken from you. Sometimes it's money. Sometimes it's time. Sometimes it's the belief that you have a right to ask." The room stayed quiet. She continued, "I don't want anyone to need this program, but if they do, I want them to walk in without feeling dirty for needing dinner before justice finishes its paperwork." That was all she said. It was enough. That evening, Annie used part of her recovered wages to buy a new pair of shoes, simple black walking shoes with good soles. She tried them on in the store and stood for a moment, testing her weight. The clerk asked, "They feel okay?" Annie looked down at her feet. "They feel honest," she said. On the way home, she stopped at the bakery she had passed for years and bought a warm loaf of bread, not day-old, not thrown away, not rescued, bought. When she reached Clara's apartment, she placed the loaf on the table with the shoes still in their box under her arm. Clara looked at the bread, Then at Annie. "Now that," she said, "smells like testimony." Annie laughed, and this time nothing broke inside it. She cut the bread in thick slices. Clara brought out butter saved in foil. They ate slowly at the small kitchen table while the city moved outside, still flawed, still hungry in places, still full of people waiting for what they were owed. But in that room, on that night, Annie was not waiting for a paycheck that might not come. She was not brushing mud off bread. She was not asking permission to be paid. She was eating what she had bought with money returned to her in her own name, and the difference tasted like more than bread. 6 months later, the first thing Annie noticed was the smell of coffee. Not the burnt coffee from Marcus Reed's office, not the weak coffee from old break rooms where workers stood because sitting felt like stealing time, but fresh coffee in large silver urns at the back of the Whitmore Foundation community room. Beside it were trays of fruit, biscuits, scrambled eggs, and small paper cards that read, "Please eat. No meeting is important enough to attend hungry." Annie had written those cards herself. The room filled slowly. Workers came in their uniforms, jackets, scrubs, delivery shirts, hotel badges, warehouse boots. Some arrived with spouses. Some came alone. Older men took seats near the aisle so they could leave early if needed. Women stood together in pairs, reading the signs on the walls before deciding where to sit. A few people looked embarrassed by the food table, until Annie walked over, picked up a biscuit, and placed it on a napkin. "Food's not decoration," she said to a woman in a housekeeper's uniform. "Please help yourself." The woman smiled a little. "You work here?" "I do." "You're Annie, right?" Annie had grown used to that question, though it still made something in her tighten. "Yes, Annie Brooks." The woman held out her hand. "Denise Miller. My sister works at a restaurant downtown." They held her tips for 3 weeks. "She told me to come ask what to do before she gets fired for asking." Annie shook her hand. "You came to the right place. Patricia's team is at the intake table. They'll explain what documents help. If your sister needs food or transit help, that's separate. She doesn't have to prove everything before she eats." Denise looked toward the table where 2 legal volunteers were setting out folders. "That last part matters." "I know," Annie said. Across the room, Edward stood near the side wall speaking with Nathan Cole, Helen, and a woman from the credit union. He looked older than he had the night by the alley, or maybe Annie simply saw more clearly now. Power had weight when a person finally stopped using it as a chair and started carrying it like a responsibility. Helen came over with a clipboard. "You have 3 minutes before we start." Annie looked at the growing crowd. "I thought I was only saying a few words. That is what every speaker says before changing the room." "Don't do that." "Do what?" "Make it sound bigger than it is." Helen looked at her over the clipboard. "Annie, there are 62 people in this room because 6 months ago you said, 'I was not trash. I was unpaid.' You may call that small if you want. I will not." Annie looked away before her eyes could give her up. Clara arrived last, because she said people over 70 had earned the right to make an entrance. She wore her navy coat and a small silver pin, shaped like an apple from her teaching years. Annie met her near the door. "You look tired," Clara said. "Good morning to you too." I said what I said. Annie hugged her carefully. "I'm fine." Clara looked around the room. Fine is too small a word for this. Before Annie could answer, Edward stepped to the front and adjusted the microphone. The room quieted, not all at once, but in pieces. Chairs scraped, coffee cups lowered, conversations faded. "Good morning," Edward said. "Thank you for coming to the first public session of No Worker Goes Hungry. This program exists for a simple reason. No one who works should have to wonder whether a late paycheck means no dinner, no medicine, no bus fare, or no rent." He paused, letting the words settle. "We built this program with legal partners, food partners, a credit union, workforce counselors, and employers willing to be held accountable. But it did not begin with an institution. It began because someone was brave enough to tell the truth about what delayed wages can do to a person's life." He turned slightly toward Annie, asking without words. Annie rose from her seat. The walk to the microphone no longer felt like the walk at City Hall, but her hands still grew cold. She placed her notebook on the small stand in front of her. Inside it was the old white business card, worn at the edges. She did not need to look at it, but knowing it was there steadied her. My name is Annie Brooks, she said. The room remained quiet. 6 months ago, I had a job and no paycheck. That is an important part of the story. I was not unemployed. I was not refusing to work. I had worked long shifts, and I was waiting for money I had already earned. While I waited, I got hungry enough to do something I thought I would never do. I looked for food that someone else had thrown away. A few heads lowered. Some people kept their eyes on her, not with pity, but recognition. A man saw me that night. He offered me money. I did not take it. Some people called that pride. Maybe some of it was. But some of it was fear. I was afraid that if I took money in that moment, the worst thing that had ever happened to me would become the only thing people saw. She looked at Edward. He did not move. What changed my life was not cash in an alley. It was someone asking why I was there in the first place. Then other people asked too. Helen asked. Patricia asked. Maria, Daryl, Tanya, Carla, Clara. They all asked different parts of the same question. Who did the work? Who held the money? Who stayed silent? Who got hurt while everybody called it a delay? Clara nodded once from the front row. Annie continued. This program is not here to make people feel small for needing help. It is here to make the right questions easier to ask before someone ends up hungry. If your pay is late, write it down. If your hours vanish, write it down. If someone tells you to be grateful while taking what you earned, write it down. And if you need dinner while justice gets itself organized, eat first. Shame can wait outside. A sound moved through the room, soft but deep. Not applause yet. Agreement. Then Maria stood from the second row. And bring your pay stubs, she said. The room laughed, and the tension broke. Daryl added, and take pictures of the time clock. Tanya lifted her coffee, and don't delete texts. Even Patricia Wells smiled from the legal table. Excellent public education. Annie stepped back as the room applauded, not loudly at first, then stronger. She returned to her seat beside Clara, who reached over and squeezed her hand. You said it clean again, Clara whispered. Was it too much? For people who need the truth, there is no such thing. After the session, the room turned into movement. Workers lined up at the legal table. Others sat with the credit union staff. Helen explained food assistance to a man who kept saying he had never asked for help before. Edward spoke with employers about wage compliance, and Nathan stood beside him, no longer trying to stay near the safest part of the conversation. Annie moved from table to table, answering what she could, pointing people where they needed to go. Near the door, Denise Miller waited with a folder pressed to her chest. My sister's coming next week, she said. Good. She saw your video, the hearing one, not the other one. Denise hesitated. She said it made her stop feeling stupid. Annie swallowed. Tell her she was never stupid. I will. By late afternoon, the coffee was gone, the food trays were empty, and the last worker had left with a folder, a voucher, or at least a name to call. Annie stayed behind to help stack chairs, but Helen took one from her hands. Go sit down. I can help. You did. Edward approached as Helen carried the chair away. You still have the card? He asked. Annie opened her notebook and showed him. The ink on the back had faded, but the words remained readable. Let Annie Brooks in. She has an appointment with me. Edward looked at it for a long moment. I wrote that so they would open the door downstairs. Annie closed the notebook. It did more than that. I know. She glanced around the room, at the empty chairs, the crumbs on the tables, the intake forms gathered in neat stacks. You didn't give me money that night. No. You gave me a door. Edward nodded. And you walked through it. Annie looked toward the glass doors at the front of the community room. Outside, Atlanta moved under the late afternoon light. Cars passed. People hurried home. Restaurants prepared dinner. Somewhere, someone was still waiting for a paycheck that should have arrived already. Annie took a slow breath. Now we open more, she said. Edward did not answer at first. He only stood beside her, a man who had once watched hunger from behind a car window and had finally stepped out. Clara's cane tapped behind them. Well, she said, if you two are done making history, somebody needs to take me home before my knees file a complaint. Annie laughed, full and unguarded. Edward smiled. Yes, ma'am. They walked out together. Clara with her cane, Edward holding the door, Annie with the old business card in her notebook, and a room behind her that would open again next week. And the week after that. The city had not become fair in 6 months. No city ever did that quickly. But one alley had led to one question. One question had led to one worker speaking. And one worker speaking had made room for others to be heard. That was not everything, but it was no longer nothing. The lesson of Annie's story is that hunger is not always caused by laziness, and poverty is not proof of failure. Sometimes a person can work hard, show up every day, and still be pushed into desperation because someone with power withheld what they earned. True kindness is not simply handing someone money and walking away. It is asking why they needed help in the first place. Annie's courage reminds us that dignity can survive even in the darkest moments, and Edward's choice reminds us that justice begins when someone refuses to look away. No worker should go hungry, and no human being should have to lose their pride before the world decides they are worth helping. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real, and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.